everyone, we made it to 2025. Congratulations. Now, thanks for sticking around with me for another year. Now, as per my annual usual tradition, I'm going to go ahead and probably take January off. If nothing else, it's good for my mental health. It gives me a chance to work on larger projects. I might return a week or two early. I don't entirely know yet. Even I don't follow my own plans sometimes. But, yeah. For now, here's every chopping block video I did, rating all the games I reviewed from worst to best. So, enjoy the show, and here's to 2025. So stick with me for some lightning reviews. This week on the chopping block. This week I decided to experience the game that is Hunt Down the Freeman. I deliberately say experience rather than play because play entails a sense of happiness, mirth, or enjoyment, and I was going into this one fully expecting to not be having fun. With me recently replaying Half-Life 2, and prior to that trying out Black Mesa and the original Half-Life 1 on PC for the first time, I figured I would see firsthand a fan attempt at continuation for the Freeman cinematic universe. Now, I'm immersed in game culture enough where I know full well Hunt Down the Freeman's reputation. A fan-built project, seemingly with no endorsement from Valve, the original intellectual property holder, and effectively release the digital equivalent of teenage fanfiction on Valve's Steam distribution service for money. The only way one could open yourself up more for abuse would be to take a Jaws of Life rescue device, wedge it into your ribcage, and set it to full open while a screen plays your internet browser history behind you. That being said, I also approached Hunt Down the Freeman with a mind of morbid curiosity, like an autopsy specialist wanting to figure out how Jaws of Life machine would affect someone's ribcage. You open the game seemingly as some random grunt being recruited for a special military unit. The tutorial, for attentive types, lays an idea of the quality of the experience right down to a mechanical level. Even movement is being experimented with in a means that any longtime fan of Half-Life will tell you is either detrimental to the experience, or at least just kind of pointless. Let's look at Half-Life 2, because the creators invited the comparison the second they decided to make this travesty. Beyond walking in Half-Life 2, what enhanced movement options did Gordon Freeman have? Run, jump, sprint, and crouch, and that was all you needed to keep the game well-paced and deliberately tight from a control aspect. Well, Royal Rudius Entertainment looked at this perfectly crafted system in the form of a grilled cheese sandwich, simple, elegant, and satisfying in its decisions, and then threw it back on the pan, emptied the contents of a beefy 5-layer burrito on top, and then sent it back out with the mindset of more stuff means a better game, adding a whole separate parkour mode along with a prone movement system. In the instances where those two options came in, the game ground to a screeching halt as I tried to recall the necessary control key, and with the parkour mode in particular, leading to some very irritating segments of limited visibility and painfully slow progression. Then there was the expanded weapon menu, which again in Half-Life 1 could be entirely navigated by the scroll wheel. Nope, too easy. Now you have to select menus and subcategories for all your different weapons. Like I said 2 paragraphs ago, pointless expansion. Anyway, after your tutorial level, you're deployed to the Black Mesa facility to fulfill the narrative obligation of getting decimated by a scientist in an orange envirosuit. The opening in particular struck me as rather presumptive because Hunt Down the Freeman shows, allegedly, Freeman treating you with a degree of brutality and deliberate cruelty, but I immediately experienced narrative dissonance on that because I never played that way. Granted, it would be very difficult to account for an individual playstyle, but it would probably have been a hell of a lot more accurate to just get grenaded by a guy you saw for 5 seconds before they kept speeding through the level. But the game needs to set up your motive, in this case you swearing a blood oath of vengeance against one random guy who, let's not forget, committed the offense of not wanting to be killed by the military. The G-Man then saves you, as I'm assuming insurance to be the guy who takes out Freeman if the G-Man loses control. Okay, I gotta stop you again, Royal Rudius. Didn't that exact thing happen when the Vortigons kept G-Man from taking him in episode 2? Well, I guess we know the end of this game and how successful you are. You then wake up in the midst of the 7 hours war and proceed to navigate the still ongoing 7-lane snowy road pileup that is the story. Watching these cutscenes alone should illustrate that... Actually, can we just focus on the fact that this game is so dissonant with the level of storytelling that Valve strives for that they went ahead and used cutscenes? Something Valve deliberately avoids because of how it breaks player immersion? Then again, maybe these people knew they couldn't compete and just decided to own the awful. Anyway, as I was saying, the cutscenes illustrate with clarity the fact that this is a fan project with the script writing, dialogue, and voice acting all fluctuating wildly from tolerable to me openly exclaiming at the computer, "What the fuck is this exchange?" Or, "Are they actually serious with this character?" Eventually, I grew to initiating a practice I rarely do. I skipped cutscenes. Granted, at times there were scenes that I was enjoying, but for entirely the wrong reasons. Mostly because I was laughing at how goddamn stupid they were. But in the end, having any option to shorten the game was a welcome one. In fact, I was debating putting on no clip to just blaze through levels. That wasn't helped when some glitch kept opening the console menu on loading screens, at which point I was just one text prompt from moving through the levels Lemillion style. Ultimately though, while the enhanced movement options were at best unnecessary, most of the rest of the game is serviceable. Beyond the clunky selection of weapons in their menu subcategories, they work well enough. You point them at baddies, pull the triggers, and the baddies go away. Although the damage at times seems inconsistent. And while the returning enemies are fine, the new enemies are more out of place than a Jaws of Life machine in someone's ribcage. They look like an old Mysterio toy that a child spent an afternoon modifying with a lighter and a can of bug spray. Looking at it in hindsight, I can't in any way recommend this game. There are moments where I could almost say that it's so bad it's good, but those moments are few and far between. It's interesting to look at and analyze from a design perspective and how morbidly twisted something attempting to follow in Valve's footsteps could be, but more than anything, I get the feeling that the developers were acting in a mindset of grandiose self-delusion and confidence, having achievements that not only trigger when the game crashes, but one that plays at the 2 hours mark called no refunds? They have to be acting in hallucinatory delirium or outright giggling contempt. If you must play this, get some friends around and treat it like an episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000. Just do yourself a favor and stay away. This week I spent a little time playing Closing Up Shop. I've given enough insight to my life and thought processes over the years in videos for viewers to know that if I'm busy or stressed, more often than not, I'll skip a weekly upload. And I was foreseeing that being the case this week. Between seeing friends and scheduling snafus, I didn't think I'd be devoting a lot of time to gaming unless something short and snacky came up. Even more so, imagine my surprise when Matt Kuna, apologies if I'm mispronouncing that, the developer behind The Warehouse from quite a few videos back, reached out to me with the hope that I'd take a crack at his next project, Closing Up Shop. And let me just take a moment to say that I'm actually very impressed with Matt. Not necessarily for the game, though. We'll get to that after I've padded out the script to stall for a little bit more time, but for the fact that creators, myself included, are extremely sensitive to criticism. The ones that succeed are often the ones that are receptive when critiques arise, so I was very much never expecting to hear back from him after my review of his previous game tore into it, albeit trying to maintain a constructive tone. And let's take a moment to do the good YouTuber thing. To reiterate, Matt asked me to play this. And it was free, but it's free for everyone. He's listed it on itch.io for free. Yeesh, talk about being receptive to criticism. I said the last one should have been cheaper and he makes his next game free. Anyway, Closing Up Shop appears to be a mixture of one of those job simulator games mixed with a moderate creature survival horror game. You're closing up a cell shop for the evening, but emergency notices declare that there's a monster in the area. You receive your instructions via phone message, similar to the first Five Nights at Freddy's, then the emergency broadcast system tells you how best to survive the creature. While the voice acting for the job tasks is fine, a default voice sim delivering the survival instructions doesn't do the game any credit and may actually disservice an attempt at tense atmosphere.
Clean up and messes in the vicinity and within a practice the place up clutter. Avoid loud noises like alarm systems. Turn on all lights in the house and...
I did find it was a nice touch that the message became muffled when you put your phone away, though. Let's say the sound design is serviceable. Next is the gameplay. Standard WASD movement and interacting with items depending on the task needed. I'd again highlight the need for customizable controls in future endeavors, Matt. Additionally, I found it somewhat irritating that the items used for cleaning up the shop could only be picked up and put down in one exact spot. It seemed counterintuitive to make it that your phone was one potential implement of survival, but couldn't be held while using cleaning supplies. Then again, I'm a freak of nature with 2 hands, so what do I know? I will go ahead and say that I did appreciate that gag at my expense with the gun. Well played, Matt. Although it does seem that the monster stays pretty scarce as long as you follow the environment directions. Once you close the shop, though, much to my surprise, there was a second phase of wandering outside. This was where things took a turn for the worse for me, especially once I had to go through an area that I couldn't tell if it was urban or forested. And I know other pundits have highlighted this in the past, but making an obnoxiously small, light-to-seer environment is both cheap and unrealistic. Don't do that. It predominantly serves to frustrate rather than add tension. I did appreciate the addition of a checkpoint system, though. Although unfortunately I didn't utilize it to the degree I might have, because unlike the last game, I didn't finish it, mostly because I don't enjoy these varieties of survival horror. Once the game left the store, it seemed like a far less honed and more generic experience. And another decision that seemingly bewilders me is the lack of a continue function when you pause the game. Seriously, I press escape to go tend to some laundry, and when I come back I have to start over. I'm pleased Matt is continuing his projects, and I can say I saw a bit more potential in this one, but I'd say keep improving for now. This week I've been playing The Warehouse. Before I start discussing the game directly, I must have a moment of disclosure. You see, I have friends that have assisted in working on this game, and I received a free copy for the sake of review. Does this mean I'm a professional YouTuber now? Ethical responsibilities aside, this gave me a unique conundrum. This is the first game I've ever received, and I was worried that it may taint my perspective and alter my biases in a couple ways. Would I look at the game in a more positive light because I was gifted it? Or would I end up overcorrecting my perspective for the sake of trying to avoid the aforementioned issue? Well, I can't say if I've remained 100% untainted on my perspective, but what opinions I've compiled so far is as honest as I can be. Personal thoughts aside, I was informed from the outset that this game was pretty much a solo-developed project, as well as this individual's first game. With that in mind, I may also be shifting gears slightly to emphasize more constructive criticism rather than just outright trying to shit on someone's passion project. With that in mind, I have a perfect place to start for improvements to the game overall. Customizable controls. The first time I booted up The Warehouse, it was on my Steam Deck, which I was surprised to see running without much issue, but unfortunately I was hampered by one thing. In my mind, customizable controls are not only an issue of preference, but a matter of accessibility. Being able to change controls and remap them to different buttons or inputs is vital to individuals that may be considered differently abled. I myself ran into an issue on the deck because a long time ago, I was exposed to the pathogen called Star Fox 64, and ever since then have suffered the condition of necessitating Y inversion in order to play a game comfortably on a controller. Well, that and potentially being exposed to the furry pathogen, but that's another matter. But yeah, as far as I'm able to tell, no means of control customization other than a few sliders for look sensitivity. Diving into actual gameplay itself, it's something of a permutation of the old Slenderman formula. Yeah, not to be unflattering, but it's the formula where you're given a list of items to collect around a hostile area, you don't really have any means of self-defense other than movement, and if the baddies catch you, then it's an instant game over. All thoroughly well-trodden paths at this point, so what ways does it differentiate? Well, it's got a few different varieties of baddies, with each one featuring slightly different mechanical twists that made it somewhat interesting to bear in mind as you were having to navigate the warehouse zones. However, some of those creatures seem to occasionally operate counterintuitively to the hint posters placed around the warehouse. I don't know if this is a subtle subversion of expectation in order to lure the player into a false sense of security, or simply a matter of coding not working, but I will say that it was a wonderful means to get me to swear at the game after experiencing what I perceived as a cheap game over once or twice. One creative choice that I was somewhat bewildered by is the matter of the player's perspective seemingly being viewed through a CCTV lens, in spite of the fact you can clearly hear yourself walking around, as well as having a sprint function with a stamina bar. Do employees have to wear body cams when we're experiencing the aftermath? It does get some explanation in the ending, but otherwise the game's story presence is minimal to almost non-existent. Almost an example of all setting, no plot. The PA announcements every so often were a nice touch, but that element was swiftly broken over my kneecap when I would initiate in-game prompts while it was already in the middle of a pre-scripted announcement, and I would be listening to multiple voices competing over the same loudspeakers.
All current anomalies inside the facility have been frozen for the next 30 seconds.
Another matter, though, was that the messages quickly began to repeat. A little bit of extra emphasis on writing and a wider variety of PA prompts would have gone a long way. Maybe on one or two individual runs it was fine, but this game was purported to be extraordinarily short if you can beat it successfully on a first try, which on my successful run lasted maybe 10 minutes. You're basically ticking off items on your shopping list as you make your way between 5 rooms with the intention of getting out. Unfortunately, beyond the slightly frantic collectathon, the game grows rather stale pretty quickly. At the time of writing, I put in maybe about a dozen attempts, and with each subsequent attempt, my desire to play this game diminishes. You see, one overarching problem with the Slenderman collection formula is that it very quickly becomes tedious. The Warehouse somewhat abates this by having room elements and spawn locations of items randomized from run to run, but that should be a given. Another design question I have, though, is why is there a jump function when there are functionally no areas necessitating platforming? There were 1 or 2 assets that looked like you could platform on them for the sake of a shortcut, but alas, I just end up hopping impotently next to the item. Furthermore, a design choice I think works to the detriment of the game is what I call the emergency timeout button. Basically, this freezes all enemies in place for about 30 seconds. A fine idea in theory, but it neuters a fair degree of tension and mystique about the creatures because one of the elements of fear that can work towards enhancing a game is a sense of mystery over whatever is chasing you. However, when you can press a button and they'll effectively stay in place for a fixed time frame so that you can get a good look at them, I can't help but feel it discredits any design the monsters may have, which is all they have because most of them are little more than static models that pursue you around the arenas while delivering stock sound effects. Although if you divorce the game from the horror element and view it as more of a mechanical challenge, it does add a moderate degree of strategy and planning around your routing. That aside, a more appropriate means of defense or a means to elude foes might have been something like a pickup akin to a flashbang that would leave them stunned but still dangerous if you get too close to them. But then again, I'm not here here to do backseat game design. Back to the budget horror title. Actually, horror may not be entirely appropriate. It does seem to have horror pretensions, but at the end of the day, the only fear I have is the fear of having to do another run when I've established to my satisfaction that I wasn't having much fun. I did beat it, and the ending did have its own hammy charm, but it would have gone a long way with a little bit more emphasis on writing and more naturalistic dialogues or scenarios. Actually, if I hadn't received my free copy for the sake of review, and by association took on a feeling of professional obligation to see it through to the end, I probably wouldn't have bothered to play enough to see the actual ending. One could say that I'm being too harsh because this is an almost solo-developed product. I'd say that argument is more applicable for it being a first project. But let's look at some other solo-developed games. Dust and Elysian Tale, any number of the works from the library of David Szymanski, Cave Story, Undertale, Stardew Valley, and I could go on. That being said, even with it being a first project, one needs to be absolutely ready to receive any number of criticisms once you release a product to sale on the market, and I would wager there are individuals that would be far less charitable and constructive than myself. Pricing-wise, especially for a first project, I'd say $5 is asking a bit much. Maybe $1 or $2 would be more appropriate. For long-term enjoyment, I'd say this game isn't going to hold up very well, even if there were improvements made. To me, it feels like one of those streamer titles where you sit around and watch one of your favorite personalities overreact to it rather than play it yourself. And to the developer, Matt, if I may call you as such, for everything I've said, know that I believe more video games in the world is a net positive, and if there's anything I want you to take away, it's not that I want you to stop, and I don't want you to stop trying. Try and take some of the things I've said as a means to springboard to something better next time. Let's look at Five Nights at Freddy's, the robust cultural sensation, as an example. That game's developer previously made a game called Chipper and Sons Lumber Company, and one of the main criticisms that game received was that the characters looked like scary animatronics. You can probably see where I'm going with this. Take criticisms, make improvements, and keep up with the work. I await to see what you come back with next time. This week I decided I'd concluded my playthrough of Starfield. As I've been making these videos, and inevitably concocted a script preempting almost every single one, I find that word choices become increasingly important in the planning stages. The use of adequate descriptors, avoiding being overly repetitive, and indeed deploying literary devices such as foreshadowing. Microsoft's Bethesda's Todd Howard's Starfield has technically been on my plate since about the end of January or early February. I've been somewhat of a fan of Bethesda's work since Fallout 3, and I've probably done about half a dozen separate Skyrim runs over the years, so the promise of a Bethesda RPG in space had some appeal. I acquired my copy when it was revealed that physical box versions were getting pulled from certain retailers with no promise of a future restock, and I'll be damned if I'm forking it for another subscription of which I'd be getting questionable use from with Game Pass. So, after installation, I began my campaign with an intense and riveting shift in a space mine. Eventually, your job takes you to a mysterious rock outcropping that causes you to hallucinate on the job, so you get sent to the nurse's office for a character creation and a drug test. Pick your appearance, background, pronouns if you feel so inclined, and then the game starts prop.
F***ing pronouns! F***ing gender ambiguity!
I swear, this man has more functioning hair follicles than he does brain cells. Anyways, baiting socially maladjusted man babies aside, the first issue is present in the start of the game, or rather I should say the first issue is the start of the game. The mining session is 100% entirely unnecessary. Bethesda could have literally started the game at the character creator and then have glossed over the opening 20 minutes of the game with a sentence or two. Bethesda's openings have a history of less than stellar design decisions, but eventually I was presented with the hook of the main campaign. Effectively, I'm approached by a representative of an organization that can be described as space archaeologists, explorers, and adventurers. That rock that gave you visions is apparently part of a set, and he wants you to find the rest and discover their secrets. As I progressed through these interactions, laced with the classic Bethesda face and conversation tree formula, for better or for worse, I found another problem that kept me from ever becoming fully immersed. My dialogue options seemed to be someone who was always eager to do whatever is needed, give a contrarian answer, or openly seeking to exploit whatever interaction to his benefit, when my genuine roleplay would have been more akin to the Saitama, okay, face. A minor quibble that may be entirely subjective, but my unenthused attitude betrayed my sentiment on the game's story and design philosophy. I was almost entirely uninterested in the game's main story progression, so I eventually started chasing down side quests and found some intrigue in a goal to aid the Galactic Military Organization and save it from an invasion of biologically designed superweapons. This has always been a positive side of Bethesda games, in that if you've gotten bored with the main storyline, you can almost always find something to divert your attention, which is good because even after awakening my space superpowers by playing a modern equivalent of Superman 64, I found the main campaign to just be significantly lacking in stakes and intrigue. This was compounded by an issue of overwhelming scope in the game, which may be considered a fancy way of saying that the game has too much stuff in it. Everywhere you turn, it seems to be throwing something new at you, and it can be too much for the average player to handle. Between the game's combat and weapon systems, crafting systems, and irritating lack of storage in my playtime, the ability to build on a home planet of your choice, shipbuilding, planetary scanning and codex filing, spaceship flight and combat, and likely a few other things that I'm forgetting at the time of writing, each system has an impressive amount of depth to it, and a more narrowed down version would have worked well in past Bethesda games, but gives me a feeling of a father seeing you enjoy playing with a Lego set, and decide that you'll probably have an equally good time reassembling a 98 Subaru station wagon. Yeah, getting down to the most basic level, it's a similar prospect that you're rebuilding something, but the knowledge and scope expansion required to get your head around it is likely going to overwhelm anyone that didn't already have an explicit interest in it. So, my attention would consistently ricochet away whenever Starfield tried to introduce a new mechanic. Eventually, I found myself attempting to fall into Bethesda RPG rhythms when I pick up a quest, follow the objectives needed to get there, and cut down the fools who stood in my way with lasers and lead. However, I began to encounter even more hurdles that kept throwing speed bumps in my path. First being the level of my opponents versus myself becoming increasingly spongy. Second is the way the game tried and utterly failed to present a seamless galaxy. I had a similar issue when I tried playing the Outer Worlds. Given how you're trekking between multiple planets, which usually necessitates numerous menus and stages for fast traveling, I began to become jaded to the different worlds and features around me because unless there was a new area with an objective marker that it was pointing me to, I found myself navigating via menu rather than walking and taking in the atmosphere. Bethesda took the vastness and majesty of space and made it tedious to explore. Finally, the Bethesda formula of RPG has, in my opinion, started to outstay its welcome. While their mechanical systems can be described as deep, the connect-the-dots story progression and structure can be comparatively described as a kiddie pool. The characters and their stories are a bit more engrossing, but they don't save the other downfalls of the formula have been getting put through the ringer of scrutiny since Elder Scrolls Oblivion. Now, at the time of writing, I put in about 20 hours into my playthrough of Starfield, which admittedly hasn't been enough to see the end or get any narratively satisfying conclusion. However, I ask you this. Over the past several weeks, I've had my copy sitting in my Xbox, beckoning me to continue, but when the desire to continue playing is less than the compulsion to clean my kitchen or find something else to play instead, would you consider that a worthwhile game regardless of the names or studios behind it? I don't dislike Starfield, but I don't like it either, though. It's just kind of there. On a technical level, it's kind of impressive, but Bethesda needs to stop relying on Todd Howard and his archaic design conventions. This week I've been playing #DriveRally, which I strongly expect has named itself that to manipulate social media metrics by simply having people talk about it. Having exercised most of the hardware compulsions I've been having these past weeks, other than just accidentally assembling computers at random, which is totally a real thing that can happen, I'm back to reviewing games at the moment. That being said, #DriveRally is one that somewhat came out of nowhere for me, but has been part of my wind-down routine almost every night on my Steam Deck. *DriveRally is a time trial racing game that, according to the Steam page, is set in the golden rally racing era of the 90s. The thing that stuck out at me the most on initial inspection was the cel-shaded art style, which made me remember Hot Shot Racing. Upon checking, it's not the same developers, but the style of cars and characters was so strikingly similar that I would have sworn it was by the same people. Anywho, while not my go-to racing game format, I do occasionally enjoy time trial and rally-style games going back to Sega Rally Championship on the Sega Saturn and arcade. Diving straight into the campaign races, or championship series in this case, the usual learning curve of figuring out the game's specific physics quirks was rather short. On default settings, the cars have a tangible weight and a consistent feel, which is one of the best things you can have in a game of this style, but seems to heavily disincentivize drifting or power slides. Not a problem necessarily, but definitely a buzzkill if you're coming off of an initial D marathon. One clever thing that social media trigger symbol DriveRally did once you're in race is to add the time trial ghost of a racer close to the top of the time trial leaderboard for you to aim for by default. You have the option to turn it off in settings, but I found it engaging and fun to chase the shadow of a faster racer to see how you could improve. Watching them was also where I discovered one of the main trade-offs that, given the early access release of the game, I'd kind of like to see modified for balance. You see, the tracks you're traversing are usually lined with tape or otherwise flimsy boundaries that, depending on the makeup of the course, are merely suggestions for your car. You automatically reset if you go too far off the road, and running over markers adds a small time penalty, but the half a second you lose by hitting markers can be worth maintaining your speed in the long run. Of course, this can become a rather irritating balancing act where you're experimenting just to see how much of a corner you can cut before the game goes and resets you back on the course from a dead stop. A balance of your time penalty increasing by how far you go off the track, or the number of times you cut exponentially multiplying the penalty, would create a much more intricate balancing act that could also eliminate the need for an automatic reset. The manual reset, however, seemed to me like it took too long of a button hold to initiate. Half the time would have been more appropriate, and while I'm nitpicking, I'm astounded at the developer's choice of seemingly locking off campaign races once you've completed them. There were tracks I wanted to go and revisit in the initial campaign, but it would not allow it for some reason. Looking at things optimistically, I'm hoping it's just a bug rather than a conscious design choice. Speaking of conscious choices though, there are several I feel need to be addressed as far as when it comes to the presentation.
Oh my gosh, are we starting? Hold on, let me fix my hair first.
Visually, the game is striking. The cel-shaded art style works well, and the cars and tracks are all distinct and appealing. Sound design choices, though, begin to reveal cracks. The music and sound effects aren't really worth noting, but the voice work and characters are definitely more troublesome. Being a rallycross game, you're often listening to your passenger to determine how to take upcoming turns. Those directions should be considered vital, so when they start interjecting with banter that overrides when you would need to receive an instruction for an upcoming turn, you can see why it would begin to frustrate. Not only that, but the lines they chose for some of the characters come across as straight up problematic. The Austrian co-pilot speaking like Arnold Schwarzenegger and the female navigator talking like a hair and beauty obsessed valley girl are one thing, but when the Asian caller is constantly making references to kung fu and whatnot, you're approaching the territory of racist caricatures.
Ready, set, go. We must be quick like kung fu fight.
At best, it smacks of lazy or unthoughtful writing, something to maybe consider for improvement before the game sees its official 1.0 release. But enough on the set dressing. I'm not here to descend into the trenches of the culture war. For a prospective rally racing game, what matters are the feel and the mechanics when you're in a race, and to its credit, Drive Rally has both in spades. The speed on the straightaways is visceral, and the turns are dynamic and intricate when you're absorbed in shaving seconds to try and reach the peak. Something I've managed to do at least once. If the foundation wasn't solid, I wouldn't keep coming back to it each night on my Steam Deck. I just pray that the devs at Pixel Perfect Dude fix the numerous issues in presentation that I've laid before them, something that they have plenty of opportunity to do while it's in early access. This week I've been playing Pony Factory. If I may level with everyone for a moment, since September I've been getting slammed harder than that Twisted Tea guy. And January wasn't quite as restful as I would have liked. Given how I've occasionally had to take breaks in order to maintain my wellness, I've elected to stop doing double bill video reviews for the sake of uploading consistently. With that out of the way, let's discuss Pony Factory. To my credit, I've been able to go at least 3 months without directly reviewing another game by David Szymanski. His last game that I did, Squirrel Stapler, was a surrealist romp and an unnerving but still enjoyable snack of a game. Compared to that, Pony Factory is a short but creepy affair, leaning a bit harder into an overtly hostile and stylistically morbid experience. Starting the game, we're once again given Szymanski's preferred style of story delivery, simple text blurb. Apparently, a man named Winston made a deal with the devil in order to try and bring happiness and morality to his town. I believe you play as Winston's son, whose goal is to dive into the heart of the building where monstrosities born of good intentions are born to wreak havoc. Starting up the actual gameplay, the first thing you'll notice is the monochrome art style, which, like watching political news, excels at relaying a sense of the ominous and the foreboding. Very quickly, you're given your only weapon for the game, which seems to come in the form of a kind of machine pistol. Now, I'll admit, I initially struggled in the first couple rooms of the game. I thought that some of the controls were broken, and, due to my familiarity with David's previous games, I briefly thought that the coding for pickups had messed up. What I discovered after some experimenting was that this game bucks the usual boomer shooter trend of just having you automatically pick up ammunition or health packs. In a subtle touch that I find superb at making you pay attention to your environment, you have to manually obtain additional ammo or health as you navigate the equine production line. Making your way deeper into the horse assembly facility becomes a little bit easier as you start to encounter environmental hazards and a second enemy type. After you get a ways into the game, you'll also start to encounter a couple environmental palette changes that inject a little bit of color, along with a sense of the unnerving. Now, while my overall impressions of Pony Factory are positive, I will say that this was the game that I started to point out Szymanski's design philosophies that are starting to become consistently observable from game to game. Not that I'm growing bored yet, but I am starting to become attuned to his particular game design formula. Another thing that makes a return from his Chop Goblins game is a somewhat basic level-based structure. It's fairly linear, and your overall goal is to keep delving deeper into the hoofed creature sweatshop, with you having to find the doorway that brings you down to the next level. Finally, I must draw attention to this game's overall length. I am by no stretch of the imagination a speedrunner, and I've probably spent about 10 minutes just messing around with settings and experimenting with a few mechanics of the game in the first couple rooms. With that in mind, the entirety of my playthrough took maybe 45 minutes. 45 minutes that I did enjoy, but also once again brings up that ever-so-spirited debate of cost versus time value. The final boss fight was also just kind of annoying and formulaic. Your limited vision and monochrome color palette ratchet up the tension a little bit, but otherwise it's just cheesing him by positioning yourself around a corner and ammo dumping him until the final door opens up. As I said, I'm starting to become a bit familiar with Szymanski's game design formulas and philosophies, but this one features just enough of a twist and a shift in mechanics to keep it feeling fresh. Now, since most of the story is delivered via an opening and a closing text box, and I'm not going to spoil the final one, I am about to relay what I would consider something of a mechanical or tonal spoiler. If you want to try this one for yourself and want to get the full experience, I would recommend ducking out now. If you're not certain or unaffected by such revelations, go ahead and stick around. Diving into the final basement room of the Clydesdale Industrial Facility, I encountered what I thought was going to be one of those gallows humor endings where you end up having to dive into machinery thinking that you're completing your goal, only for it to end with you turning into nothing more than another cog in the machine, or indeed processing material for the Philly Forge. What I wasn't expecting was for you to be able to go into the final machine, effectively grab the magical source behind everything, and then your goal is to get yourself back out of the building, right along the same course that you just took. hook. This shift of expectation, and indeed new challenge to navigate already tread territory, was just the shot in the arm that this game needed in order for me to be reinvigorated, and I found to be this game's standout feature in my opinion. You see, I briefly touched on the fact that you need to manually pick up all health and ammo, and with that in mind, I was abundantly aware of how much I may have just potentially hobbled myself from my endeavor to get back out of the building. This unintentionally self-imposed ratcheting of challenge and tension was one of the most refreshing twists that I've experienced in quite some time. This week I've been playing Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, and before you ask, yes, I am prioritizing saying it that way. I'm not intimately familiar with the history of the linguistics, but I more or less know that Chernobyl is considered a Russian pronunciation for a Ukrainian region, and considering Russia is vastly contributing to the net f***ery of the world, I look for any small and petty chance to say f*** Putin and whatever radioactive toxicity he chooses to spread on mankind. Speaking of which, Stalker, or Stalker, Shadows of Chernobyl, has been on my backlog playlist for a long time. Excluding Atomic Hearts, I've been wanting to expand my experience with games from the Eastern European developers since they seem to have a penchant for impressive, oppressive, and immersive atmospheres. Considering that some of the developers who went on to make the Metro series started cutting their teeth on Shadows of Chernobyl, I had a lot of optimism. I actually tried playing once before, but had some difficulty due to my usual PC gaming adjustment period where I needed to remap most of the controls to fit on my chosen peripherals. Fortunately, GSC Games has re-released the Stalker series thus far with an emphasis on improved controller support along with updated quality of life features and textures. Starting up, we're shown a cutscene that sets the tone of what to expect in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. That is, danger and an ever-present sense of your own mortality. The protagonist, that is you, are then picked up by some scavenger and brought to the shopkeep that gives you your first quest of the game and assists you through your amnesia with locking your main story objective, which is to find and kill another person named Strelok. Who is he? Not sure. Why do you want him dead? No idea. Just go find the answers through the quests you complete along the way. Minimal story introduction out of the way, you're then let loose in the world of Stalker, or rather I should say the semi-linear micro sandboxes of Stalker. While some areas are open to exploration, it works kind of like a thread and bead setup, where narrow corridors lead to more open areas that narrow back down when moving from zone to zone. In your exploration, you're bound to come across hostile creatures or various armed thugs, and in terms of type of first-person shooter, Stalker does not go for the route of the power fantasy. I won't say the game is realistic, but it definitely does not go for the portrayal of you as some means of super soldier. The first mission of the game, you're given nothing more than a pistol and are told to eliminate a group of bandits for information. Even placing a headshot doesn't guarantee a kill, and the only reason that the first mission is somewhat bearable is that you're fighting alongside about 4 or 5 NPCs. As the game progresses, your combat ability is more tied to the equipment that you can manage to scroll off of whoever you can take down along the way, but don't think you can just hoard each and every weapon and item you come across. You have a somewhat limited inventory weight capacity, and in order to remain mobile and capable under an emergency, you can rarely carry more than a main rifle and one sidearm in addition to whatever healing items, relics, and ammunition you find. In fact, I had a rather pained moment when I had to separate myself from a Kalashnikov with a decent long-range scope and upgraded firing speed because no one was dropping AK ammo anymore, and if I went into one more fight, I'd be running completely dry on ammo. As much as I knew that the rifle was amazing, it was going to be useless if I didn't adjust my plans to be able to source ammunition after battles. This needed focus on inventory management is one of several ways the game communicates its oppressive atmosphere. While the nuclear exclusion zone may sometimes appear empty, it never feels dead. From localized anomalies, to the whistling of the wind, to the clicking of your Geiger counter, to the pop of distant gunshots of some faction vying for control in some battle you're not yet involved with, this is the exact atmosphere that I came here looking for. There's even some small details that really drew me in, such as some NPCs being hostile on initial encounters with me being confused as to why, until one of their voice lines expressed displeasure at me keeping my firearms out when walking up to communicate, so I started stowing my weapons when I wanted to talk to someone and immediately turned more friendly. Of course, humans aren't the only things you have to worry about. In the early game, I nearly got my shit rocked by a pack of wild mutant dogs. Then, much later on, as I was forced to traverse some radioactive and hazardous sewers, I was introduced to the semi-human monsters with supernatural powers that left me genuinely fearful to move forward. I eventually overcame them by confronting them face-to-face and mag-dumping them, but it was not a fight that I felt confident in my ability to negotiate. In my opinion, it says something to the tension of the game when you can be gifted a fully automatic rifle and still be afraid of a confrontation, and I can't help but love drinking it in. Of course, that doesn't mean the game is perfect by any stretch. While the game has received significant controller support in order to work on consoles, it still has some of that late 90s shooter jank that if you've ever experienced, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Lapses in opponent AI, animations messing up, and graphical glitches for assets in the world occasionally threw me out of the immersion. On top of that, there was another sequence-breaking event that I came across where as I walked through a certain part of the map, it triggered a cutscene prompt where the camera was wrenched away from me in order to observe a battle unfolding. However, I got killed, and upon reload, I found a different route where I didn't go through the area where the trigger was activated. I successfully navigated the battle, and then began my usual ritual of scrounging around for ammunition and healing items, but in doing so, I walked back through the trigger area, and the camera was once again wrenched away, but this time it was doing a cinematic shot of a mess of bullet holes and dead bodies. As much of the quality of life improvements are appreciated, a few other things proved a nuisance when they came up. It didn't communicate that there were only so many slots for manual saves, so I ended up losing significant progress thinking that I was saving along the way, only for it to never have been taken. Additionally, if I paused the gaming session, put the console to sleep, then started playing again later and went through one of the doors of the world that require a loading screen, it would instead crash and boot me to the console main menu. I still haven't found a shop where I can offload some of my extra resources, but at this point I'd rather continue exploring myself than to ruin the mystique of looking up a wiki. Finally, I would have liked some subtitles that translate some of the foreign language lines that are playing when you reach settled areas. As you can likely hear, I've built up a list of nitpicks, but that doesn't change the fact that at a time of writing, I'm still playing it, I'm planning on playing more, and I'm looking forward to the other installments in the Stalker franchise moving forward. It's a fascinating exercise to see the foundations being laid that were later iterated on with the Metro series, and it leaves me genuinely looking forward to Stalker 2. Given how much tomfoolery has been going on in the game industry and how genuinely jaded I am to most gaming marketing materials, that's saying something. If the Stalker trilogy gets a physical copy iteration released here stateside, I'm going to snatch that up as soon as I humanly can. Anyone interested in atmospheric and oppressive shooters should snap this up immediately. Just be prepared to encounter a few lapses in polish that'll try to jettison you out of the experience. This week I've been playing Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Prior to this game's release, Indiana Jones has been one of those franchises that I haven't paid attention to in a long time. I've seen and liked the first 4 movies. No, I don't hate the 4th. In my opinion, it was fine up until the last 5 minutes or so. I haven't seen the 5th, but these days I'm hesitant to give any regard to most continued cinematic endeavors, as by my opinion, the movie industry has just been desperately desecrating the corpses of old properties that should be left alone for the sake of revenue. Speaking of ransacking and pillaging the works of the past, we open the game playing as Dr. Henry Jones Jr., world-famous archaeologist and possibly the most renowned member of Antifa, as he endeavors to travel the globe finding ancient secrets from civilizations of the past and rightfully bashing Nazis. It kind of seems like the perfect path of progression for Machine Gun Games, whose prior works consisted of the modern Wolfenstein games, a series renowned for its snappy gunplay and over-the-top first-person shooter action. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, by contrast, opens to a much more mellow and deliberately paced affair. The opening and tutorial level is a recreation of the start of the Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie. It was an amusing and visually well-done way to start the game, although I did start to acquire nitpicks while I played. The game very clearly is endeavoring to achieve a cinematic presentation with appropriate camera angles and the John Williams-esque score accompanying, but the transition from cinematic cutscene to first-person view is rather sudden and jarring. A sweeping transition with the camera eventually moving into alignment with Indiana's eyeline would have better maintained the player immersion rather than just ripping into Dr. Jones's perspective. Minor quibble on camera movements aside, once the opening concludes, you find Dr. Jones in his college and in an endeavor to stop a burgling of some artifacts, gets his ass beat and begins a quest that starts with him wondering why someone took a mummified cat. As is the style of other ventures of Dr. Jones, he is eventually led to the intrigue of secret societies, archaeological discoveries, and the thwarting of some evil entity who seeks to use said discoveries to aid their goals of power and dominance, often through the employ of some manner of supernatural phenomenon along the way. In this case, Jones follows the breadcrumbs to the Vatican and beyond and finds that the Nazis are once again trying to harness mysterious global forces. The story is fine, and the environments do a good job of communicating direction in the world while feeling alive and active. One thing I noted early on was the game's move away from blistering action and more to emphasizing stealth and observation, especially in combat because, as a reminder, Dr. Jones often finds himself sticking out as the sole American sore thumb in a fascist Italy. With much of the game seeming to favor stealth over action, the game actually gives me heavy vibes of Dishonored, which isn't a bad thing. Also, at times I was getting so into it that I pretty much forgot I had a pistol a good chunk of the time, which was probably for the best. Just to experiment, I did try to go on a Nazi shooting spree, but was cut down inordinately quickly. Although in a third way to deal with enemies, you can engage in melee combat, or as I came to refer to it, the melee combat. Even in the movies themselves, Dr. Jones seems to avoid direct face-to-face combat, and when he does get into brawls, they're usually chaotic and sloppy, and for better or worse, that has been translated to the game. For the occasional grunt, it was tolerable, but once in a while you get locked into a boss fight that can knock off 33% of your health bar with a single blow, while you can wail on them over and over with seemingly minimal effect. A stark contrast with your ability to interact with most everything else, although even the world did seem to have its own issues. At one point, my ability ability to progress through the game came to a screeching halt because something didn't load properly on the back end, and I couldn't trigger a door opening animation until I'd quit and forced a shutdown in the game, restarted, then I was able to progress once the game had reloaded. Also, in the middle of a lengthy puzzle sequence, I had an ever so lovely hard crash out to the home screen, resetting my puzzle progress. That was fun, he said, clenching his teeth while contemplating throwing his controller across the room. From the low of the glitches I've experienced, I feel I should then turn to the parts of the game that drew me in the hardest. The sense of adventure and discovery. Grabbing a torch and slowly descending into ancient catacombs or secret chambers. Looking for the tiniest details to give indication of booby traps, which, yes, did occasionally happen, or if there were prior occupants was the most engaging part. Seated on the edge of my couch, eagerly gripping my controller, I delved in with a mindset of mystery and adventure. The small touches of being able to pull out your journal to briefly give you directional markers as if to gift you with Dr. Jones's knowledge while pulling out reference material added to the immersion. This is what I felt is the essence of Indiana Jones, which is why it was all the more infuriating when some glitch would rip me right back out. Maybe I wouldn't harp so much on the technical issues if it wasn't for the fact that for the second week in a row, we have a good illustration of games being bought at or close to launch being in a buggy state. If only I'd made a video saying there was no point in buying games when they come out due to modern development tactics. Oh well. Pushing past the technical gripes, I'm actually thoroughly enjoying Indianapolis Johnson and the Large Sphere. Attempting to ignore the awful melee combat, it's probably the most authentic feeling Indiana Jones experience outside the first 3 movies. I'm pleased to see Machine Gun Games expanding their talents, and with the understanding that a first game is usually a proof of concept and a second game attempts refinement, I'd be down for more. Just please, no more melee boss fights. This week I've been playing This War of Mine. It's been a priority on my backlog for at least 2 years, and I figured with certain political happenings, in conjunction with the Supreme Court deciding on a president being more akin to a king, I might as well get some experience for the likely future for America. That's not gonna date the out of this review, is it? Modern social commentary aside, I often seek out games that are meant to instill feelings other than joy or excitement. While fun is definitely a facet of many games, engagement can be found in many titles that are explicitly not fun. Being an interactive medium gives extraordinary potential to experience the full spectrum of human emotion. So, with that setup established, let me say that, while This War of Mine is definitely a game I keep coming back to, I have played very few games that make me feel depressed, anxious, or as miserable as this piece of software. This War of Mine wears its intentions on its sleeve from the word go. It's a resource and management game where you try to establish a safe house for a small number of people that you task with crafting, bartering, or scavenging what you need in order to survive as civilians caught in the crossfire of a military conflict. You can see why this was relevant when this game was released, and even more so now. For gameplay, This War of Mine is broken up into 2 phases, day and night. During daylight hours, you and your crew try to use whatever resources you've scrounged together in order to keep yourselves going. As one could expect for innocents caught in any modern combat zone, hunger is an ever-present force looming over your head, and you're considered doing well if you're always just 1 meal away from general homeostasis. Food isn't your only concern, though. At any given point, one of your party may become sick or injured, requiring further resources and time to ensure you can keep functioning. Your base has upgrades you can sink resources into for benefit down the line if you can assemble the materials necessary, and that's a big if. The game opens with what seems like a decent amount of items on your first day by cleaning up your shelter, but this is insidious misdirection, and unless a certain path is taken down the line, having any such amounts of useful items will be a rare if not impossible occurrence, but more on that in a moment. The second phase of This War of Mine is the array of nighttime scavenging missions. You're given a map and some background on the local areas that contain resources along with potential inhabitants and expectations for visitors. The first few in-game days are relatively peaceful, getting players familiar with the sneaking and gathering mechanics along with tool usage. However, resources are finite, and eventually you'll have to move on from the abandoned areas to the places that are very much trying to do the same exact thing you and your crew are attempting, which is just survive. The path I alluded to will very much come into play when other people are a universal factor in your scavenging. How much is your humanity worth to you? Will you suffer with your fellow man to exist, or will you become a demon to gain momentary comfort at the cost of the life of another? Will you barter and be guaranteed a certain degree of safety at the expense of fewer resources, or will you put yourself in danger for the potential benefit of a day of comfort or a guarantee of a necessary base upgrade, but put yourself in danger in the process? I find it a little irritating when the game is using binary switches to relay your crew's emotional status. This person has been hungry for 3 days. He is now sad. Bitch, I don't need you to tell me this. I've been controlling it and watching him. Those are my emotions right now. For additional nitpicks, I occasionally came across scenarios where I'd visited a place, scouted it out, and was able to return the next night and load up before a single in-game hour had passed. An option to go back out during the same night if under a certain time threshold would seem reasonable to me, especially in an extreme survival scenario, but no. One gathering session per night. You will not deviate from these rails that we have laid out. I get the need to instill a sense of urgency and the need for efficiency, but this seems overly cruel. Then again, that is exactly what this war of mine seems to be going for. This war of mine is the exact polar opposite of a power fantasy. A reality check of weakness, if you will. You're not playing a game about surviving. It's a game about suffering. You're not gathering food to feed your crew. You're slowly starving to death. In the grand scheme, if the powers that be need to smash into each other, anyone caught in their blast radius is not but an insect in their eyes. But even so, each one has a story, a life, a desire to exist and be content. It's equal parts easy and hard to recommend this war of mine. On the one hand, how many people want to play a game as gut-wrenchingly miserable that reminds us of several ongoing conflicts across the world? Then again, there are those that I would argue need to play this game. War is hell, and not just for those that fight it. As a quote from Ernest Hemingway states on one of the opening loading screens says, "In modern war, there is nothing sweet nor fitting in your dying. You will die like a dog, for no good reason." In fact, if you have a relative that has said a civil war is coming and they're ready to fight, that's the person who needs to play this more than anyone. Sorry if this one got a little heavy, but I can't stress enough how important games like this one are. If you do want to give this game a try, play it for an in-game day or two at a time. I'll see if I can find something a little bit more lighthearted for next week. This week I've been playing The Oregon Trail. That's the remake that came out on the Switch a couple weeks back, not the original PC game that came out decades ago that kids played in their elementary school computer labs. Although I do have this nifty handheld version I bought for $20, played once, and now just look at on the shelf. Quirky novelty hardware aside, I did play one of the original versions on an old IBM computer lab machine back in the day, and I do have something of a reverence for it as a seminal piece of software, so when I saw it was getting a modern remake, I ordered a copy for the Switch, though it is also available on other consoles and Steam. The Oregon Trail, a game with an early version literally capable of being played on computers that operate off of paper punch cards, isn't a technical marvel, nor does it need to be. Starting off, we're presented with way more menus than I was expecting, but this betrays a game that I came to discover has an immense level of replayability if the game vibes with you. Apart from the main attraction of navigating the Oregon Trail, you can opt to take secondary paths, sometimes with varying objectives, pre-written characters, and unlockable items for subsequent playthroughs. I say subsequent playthroughs because unless you're a master at planning and have literal precognition, you are not going to succeed on your first run. That is, unless you decide to take the easy mode version just for sightseeing purposes. There's also the obligatory hardcore mode version for people that like to punish themselves, but now I'm getting sidetracked. The people you can acquire at the start of an individual campaign are randomly generated with different stats, abilities, and personality quirks that have a drastic effect in specific moments. For instance, you don't want to have a person with a messy trait being the person to apply bandaging and first aid when someone else gets injured. With that in mind, this game reminds me of Darkest Dungeon 2, but far less overtly bleak. You can even select your paths in a similar fashion and then watch your group navigate the trail and see what happens along the way. It's a low-intensity experience and good for relaxing with, but that doesn't mean you can entirely zone out. Secondary goals include documenting wildlife in the in-game journal, and you do that with a button press when they appear on screen. You then gain experience for I'm not entirely sure what, but I chalk that up to the positive mental reinforcement triggers needed to bring this game's rather basic formula up to a standard that matches modern game design for better or for worse. There's also chat dialogue segments that turn into QuickTime events that can have consequences for your party members. Lastly, the game includes an autosave feature and also gives some quality of life improvements, such as being able to hire a guide to have a fresh start from the last major settlement you reached, ensuring that most will be able to complete the game eventually. Speaking of which, getting back to my initial run, my first party seemed to be doing rather well until we hit the final third of the trail. Then, in the span of a single section, 2 of my cohorts died, and 1 ran off after fighting with the one who became my last member. Funnily enough, between her competent stats, abilities, and only needing supplies for 1, I thought she'd make it, until she got 1 mile out of the last major settlement before the destination, broke her leg, and died. That's a big thing to focus on too, because luck plays a significant role from moment to moment. Unfortunately, that's also where the game becomes the most frustrating. While luck favors the prepared, this game can relish shitting on you, especially when minor side objectives and rewards are dependent on whether or not a bear comes up and decides to break your arm. Also, rivers. The second 20% of my journey was under starvation conditions after my wagon tipped, I lost all my food, and my group was grossly ill until I stumbled into the next town. Then again, while specific scenarios may be a stretch, the Oregon Trail wasn't a notoriously difficult journey with an estimated 20 to 30,000 people perishing on the journey, so historically it does a decent job of driving that point home. Actually, the historical value of the era this game portrays is worth noting. With the trend of historians bringing to light that America had a bit of a genocide issue with the indigenous peoples, the game seems to be attempting to showcase matters in a slightly more balanced and accurate perspective. Oh boy, I get to attend this treaty signing. I'm sure the United States will honor the conditions, and I can't wait to see how they're doing at their encampment at Sand Creek in 15 years. Gallows humor aside, while I don't see myself devoting too much more time to this game, I did enjoy what time I spent with it. While the original and very basic formula from way back when is still intact, quite a bit has been added and expanded to make this an engrossing title for those with a penchant for low-intensity, strategic, or historical games. And all these years later, I can calm my inner 10-year-old by saying that I finally made it to Oregon. This week I replayed Limbo. Yeah, I've been threatening to review this one for a while now. You know the deal by this point. I work for a living, there's only so much time in a day, I have a crippling heroin addiction, we've all heard it before. So, while I make an attempt to progress on a larger video, and with the understanding that I'm likely working at the time this goes live, let's discuss Limbo. I've been technically looking to replay it for years. I got it back in the day when it was originally released on the Xbox Live Arcade, or XSpla, way back in 2010, and while I couldn't remember specific details about the game other than it being a realistic and scary platformer, I do remember the ominous mood the game carries. Having just replayed it over the course of a couple hours, I'm confident in stating that the mood and atmosphere is its strongest trait. From the very start, you're given nothing. No plot explanation, no text, no tutorial, just move to the right and maybe things will become clearer. Do they? Well, spoiler alert I suppose, but like, they do. All I was able to tell was that the little boy you're playing as is seeking out a little girl, and that's seemingly the end objective. The other one is like the last mission of Halo Reach. Survive. Limbo is arguably one of the first examples of the subgenre of brutal, small child in a scary world games, of which Playdead Studios seems to have made their bread and butter from. Then again, they only have 2 games to their name, but 2 bangers with consistent themes and tones isn't a bad thing. Anyways, Limbo doesn't hesitate to tell the player how little it cares about shocking you. Class is in session, and death will be your teacher. Limbo's monochrome art style still holds up, and while certain aspects are left to the imagination, a surprising amount of detail is present so that the player can discern vital clues to the environment so that they can avoid being dismembered, skewered, crushed, drowned, shocked, or reduced to bloody giblets. I don't speak with any exaggeration when I say I still jumped at a few moments when I expected to pass an obstacle, only for my timing or judgment to be a little off and was swiftly met with another grisly end. The traps and hazards don't just serve as hurdles to overcome, though. They also serve the purpose of world building. You seem to come across tribes of hostiles at one point. There are mysterious creatures and parasites that become essential to understand for the sake of some puzzles, and this game may unironically be the worst thing ever to give to an individual with arachnophobia. Unfortunately, if you intend to play this game in one non-stop session like I did, then you may find that the mood is difficult to maintain. After a while, the deaths become little more than a slight inconvenience and lose a degree of their shock factor. To that note, if anyone is looking to try Limbo if they haven't already played it, then play it in chunks, like maybe a half hour at a time. You'll still get a good 4 or 5 sessions out of it by my estimations, and it'll give your mind a chance to re-sensitize so that events close to the end retain more of an impact. Although that may not apply to everything. I took time to mention the emphasis on environmental storytelling, and towards the end things seemingly get even more trippy and surreal with gravitational puzzles in what is otherwise a fairly grounded game. It threw me out of the experience to a minor degree and got me wondering if the game was trying to say something about the world being interpreted through the eyes of a child with an overactive imagination. Then again, Inside did the same thing and seemed slightly more grounded in a sci-fi setting, so it could just be one of Playdead's regular tactics to induce a sense of the uncanny. Whatever the case, Limbo by and large still holds up in my opinion. It's frequently on sale, and anyone with even a moderate interest in anything I've said about it should get it at some point. Plus, with Playdead working on a 3rd game with their iconic style, it's yet another thing to set expectations for the future. Although it is being funded by Epic, so I hesitate to be only enthusiastic. This This week I've been playing Backpack Hero. I started playing Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, but between that and my Starfield playthrough, as well as my usual excuse of work, there are only so many hours in a day. So instead, let's talk about a game that initially came across as rather insubstantial, but I keep coming back to it, so here we are. Backpack Hero starts off with you playing as a little mouse girl named Purse as she's exploring some nearby catacombs for resources. She stumbles across a magic backpack that grows as you wander into the dungeon and gain experience. As the backpack grows in size, you can fit more items, many of which have their own subset effects on encounters with creatures that you must fight or navigate around. Thinking about it, it seems like someone decided to take the inventory management system of Resident Evil 4 and expand it into an entire dungeon-crawling roguelike RPG. Although I don't know if dungeon crawling would really apply as an appropriate term. In reality, you're shown segments of a map, and all you have to do is click on the part of the map you want to go to. In fact, most parts of the game are extremely simple to navigate. Combat is boiled down to clicking on the enemy you want to affect and then clicking on the weapon you want to use on their face. When you get out of the dungeon and back to your home base/village, you can just click on wherever you want to move or whoever you want to interact with. On PC, the game is entirely navigable using only a mouse, but it does also translate rather well to the Steam Deck, which has turned into one of my favorite places to score a quick hit run on this game right before bed. You see, under this extremely simple presentation and streamlined interface lays a game with almost jarring levels of complexity compared to what I initially experienced. The early game eases you in somewhat gently with the item and inventory management. It gives you a simple sword, a shield for defense in order to weather opponent turns, and an item that allows you additional action points in order to perform more tasks on your own turn. Soon you're introduced to more item and weapon types with their own unique mechanics and operations that force entirely different means of thinking and associated inventory management schemes. You see, some items require that they either be touching others in order to operate properly, or operate at all, or you may receive bonuses to boost your damage or defense as needed, and all of this has to take place within the limitations you set with however you decide to build your own backpack out. One illustration of these mechanics at work are one mission I performed based around whetstones. You see, whetstones are an item that you can use your action point to activate that boosts the damage of your weapons that are in the same row or column. However, you can push that boost rather significantly on very low damage items like shivs that can be used without using action points. So if you can build up an entire row and column of nothing but shivs, you can end up performing absurd amounts of damage with whetstone stacks. And I'll be honest, I'm a little bit smooth-brained, so I'm still trying to wrap my head around magic and spell dynamics. But then you go ahead and introduce status ailments or buffs, missions with certain legendary items that twist the mechanics even further, and a whole mess of other designations or item types that I'm probably forgetting, just because one of the side objectives of the game is to discover all 800 plus items you can pick up in the dungeon, many of which have their own unique gimmicks. Now, in the game, Purse is trying to find all these items to help benefit and rebuild her village. This is where you receive most of the framing for the story, but you'll occasionally encounter story moments in the dungeon, such as other characters you can recruit to play as. Unfortunately, the way the narrative and character aspects are presented, I grew weary of the tropey story and began to just cycle through the text boxes as fast as I could, often accidentally bypassing essential information that laid out what was needed for forward progression. In fact, I had to do a Google search in order to figure out what I needed to do in order to access the second level of dungeons after I was running out of tasks to complete in the early game. Actually, much of the game has a bit of an issue with not clearly communicating what you may need to do at any given time, whether that's extending from narrative or quest completion to the way some of the more mechanically complicated item management may affect you. Not that that was absolutely devastating in and of itself. Much like Spiritfarer, I find this game is one that is best enjoyed by simply losing yourself in the moment of doing casual dungeon runs, which can be done fairly quickly if that's what you want. It also heavily incentivizes experimentation. Yeah, if you're focusing on progress, then you'll likely find an item or a few weapon drops to latch onto for the sake of ease of use and familiarity, but that can be highly subjective to weapon drops, and sometimes survival may depend on you getting clever or risky with your tools. Of course, as with most roguelikes, you can get thoroughly screwed over with just the certain item combinations that just don't mesh very well together, or you may start out trying to build a certain way, but in the latter half, the RNG may not be willing to cooperate. A liberal autosave feature ensures that you usually are able to go back and retry some of the more difficult encounters, but I've also lost some fairly substantive runs by having a loadout that wasn't able to see me through some trickier boss sequences. Although, given the interlocking systems in place, sometimes me succeeding or failing a more difficult fight came down to a single order of operations with my clicks. And believe it or not, you can even mix things up further with different characters you can unlock. For instance, you unlock another character by the name of Satchel, and whenever you unlock spaces for his inventory, they come already prearranged in Tetris-like blocks, and he sucks at combat, so you get to access entirely different ranges of tools that end up making enemies switch sides. Time after time, this game just continues to throw new gimmicks and complexities at you, and while the mechanics may not necessarily be pulse-pounding or exciting, I was always being mentally stimulated in some place or another. All this from a cutesy pixelated little game about managing your bags. And much like a well-organized bag, Backpack Hero holds an alarming amount of content for something that looks like it would be more at home with simple platforming. The story may come across as kind of vapid, and the mechanics can be a little bit obtuse and overly ornate at times, but I find myself clicking back in for another dungeon run whenever I find myself with an idle moment. This week I've been playing Flat Out Ultimate Carnage. I wasn't certain I'd have a game to discuss this week due to work obligations. That being said, for some peeking behind the scenes for anyone that wants to do their own thing, YouTube heavily incentivizes a weekly upload schedule, and I often find myself caught in a dilemma of whether or not I want to play something for content versus playing something because I want to. I was thinking of playing Limbo for the sake of a review because it's relatively quick, I have a few things to say about it, and it would help me maintain the schedule, but at the same time I wouldn't be as passionate about it compared to if I was playing something because I chose to do so in my spare time. That being said, Flat Out Ultimate Carnage has been my primary personal choice when I'm winding down in bed with my Steam Deck, so here we are. Flat Out Ultimate Carnage is the 5th game by Bugbear Interactive by my recollection, and the 3rd game in the Flat Out franchise. Scrutinizing it heavily, you can see it as Flat Out 2.5 because it basically took the foundations such as physics, graphical style, and overall presentation of Flat Out 2, increased the visual fidelity, and expanded the number of AI opponents that could be present in a race. In fact, in my opinion, the only area where Ultimate Carnage was inferior was the soundtrack because 2 had Yellow Card. There's actually a substantive list of improvements and features that this game implements using Flat Out 2 as a springboard, but let's dive into the meat and potatoes of Ultimate Carnage on its own for now. Starting out, the UI is simple and well designed. On a fresh playthrough, you'll begin races in the Derby mode, the slowest class of car with all the vehicles looking like beaters or rusty redneck daily drivers. Of a side note, if you want to get a challenge, do as I did and go for the real habanero achievement, which requires you to beat all Derby Cups with an unupgraded chili vehicle. It'll give you a real taste and appreciation for unlocks and better vehicles when you can get them later in the game. I also appreciate Flat Out's Derby Cup because it serves as something of a tutorial without actually wasting time with a tutorial. The difficulty is relatively low starting out, and at the speeds that you start moving at, you're given a chance to become acquainted with the physics of the game and how your car will behave in it. Of course, the cars aren't the only thing affected by the in-game physics engine. Debris, obstacles, and other fixtures on the racetracks are entirely indestructible and factor in an interesting dynamic. In order to gain nitro for your vehicle to save your ass when things get hairy, you can either damage your opponent's vehicles, you can ramp off jumps with your bar filling up during airtime, or you can take out destructible items. The only problem with that being, depending on the weight of the item you're hitting, it may mess up your car's racing line, or if you're on a race with multiple laps, present a hazard for the next time around that you set up for yourself. This is arguably one of the most engaging things from race to race, because you may become familiar with the tracks relatively quickly, but even if you have an ideal racing line in your head, there's no guarantee that the wreckage from the track will allow you to take it. Even your own car may behave with a degree of foreseeable chaos, incentivizing certain driving styles or discretions when it comes to approaching track features, which says nothing of your opponents. Amongst the many things that I hold dear in the Flat Out series, one can be illustrated with a minor moment from the review of the original Flat Out that I did years ago. The AI is not dictated by your own pace. If you f*** up and one of the other racers with a better vehicle gets out in front of the pack, you may never see them again unless they screw up by hitting the debris or taking a turn wrong. It also becomes particularly absorbing through a subtle tactic of naming, giving faces, color coding, and assigning consistent vehicles to each AI opponent. Jason Walker, Jack Benton, and Lee Bing became active rivals and painted my side with every cup I participated in, and given that their vehicles were easily recognizable, I could discern when I had an opportunity to slam it into a wall at maximum speed, and let me tell you, the degree of satisfaction you experience when you can successfully wreck one of the computers that's been giving you grief is difficult to replicate anywhere else. Interestingly though, most of the things that I've given some degree of praise to, from the dynamic destruction of the environment to the behavior of your vehicle, can also become a source of frustration. I've lost count of the number of times when I've been dashing in a mad sprint towards the finish line, only for a small piece of wreckage to knock against my undercarriage as I drove over it, causing my car to careen into a direction that I wasn't anticipating. Of course, even when this does spell doom for a particular run, it's not the kind of frustration that causes me to put down the game and walk away. Instead, I grit my teeth, swear under my breath, grip the controls a little tighter, and dive in with the mentality of, screw you, I'm not letting you beat me. Now, the racing and demolition derby modes in and of themselves would be enough to keep me coming back, but Flat Out has always had a bit of a sense of humor about itself, manifesting with bonus minigame modes where you utilize the driver being ejected through the windshield as a projectile in order to do things such as go bowling, play poker, skip stones, or compete in Olympic events such as the high jump. There's also a medley of amusing hidden vehicles such as school buses, vintage roadsters, or the Flatmobile. In my opinion, Ultimate Carnage serves as the pinnacle of the Flat Out series, which I think only builds to the legacy of Bugbear, considering it's the last Flat Out game that they developed, even though there have been at least 2 more that I'm aware of. In fact, not to spoil my intentions, but I am in the planning phase for a bigger video for the history and legacy of Bugbear's gameography. Given that Flat Out Ultimate Carnage is verified on Steam Deck, and with the last Steam sale you could get it for around $5, I would recommend this to most anyone who's looking to scratch that quality arcade racing itch. This week I've been playing Warhammer 40k Speed Freaks. Well, I say this week, but in reality it's been more of a case of a match here, a match there, a couple rounds for various hardware testing, and I only sat down to seriously check out for the last day or two. I also mentioned that I had it on my wish list for an extraordinarily long time after seeing some early promo footage of what looked to me like a racing game with combat elements. Now that I've spent some time with it, I think it's more accurate to say it's a combat game with racing elements. Before going forward, let's state two things for the record. 1. I don't know jack shit about the Warhammer universe other than there are no good guys. A friend told me that, and that same friend tried to get me into the board game, and no offense to them, but it bored the tits off me. The lore seems interesting after judging whatever I've passively absorbed through cultural osmosis, but until I actually sit down to read something, don't expect a knowledgeable take. 2. This review should be seen as more of an early impressions video, as the game is in early access, and while mechanically polished, it's rather sparse in content. Okay? Okay, let's get started. At the time of writing, there are two modes, Def Rally and Kill Convoy. Daka Frenzy is basically just Def Rally with no cooldowns. Def Rally consists of two teams of weaponized vehicles racing to capture a point, then scoring points by fragging or crumping opponents while a point is captured. Side note, can someone explain the linguistic point or subtle nuance of the word crump beyond just being a synonym for unaliving someone in the comments? Thanks in advance. Anyway, once enough opponents have been taken out or enough time has elapsed, the point changes and you repeat the cycle. Once that's taken place enough, the finish line opens up and more points are awarded depending on how high you finish. The other mode, Kill Convoy, is a mixture of team deathmatch, reverse capture the flag, and payload race. There are two giant robots attempting to reach a goal point. You can slow down the opponent's mech by killing enemy team members or running bombs into their mech. The team whose mech finishes first wins. To aid both of these modes, players can pick 8 vehicles with different traits, weapons, and specializing roles. Having played a few matches, the game feels more like a high-octane and arcadey World of Tanks. Faster speeds, more extreme terrain, and the fact you can respawn. Then again, I've got no direct experience with World of Tanks beyond Russian Badger videos. Now, I didn't expect to be trying this game out much for two reasons that kind of go hand in hand. 1, it's a multiplayer game, and 2, none of my friends were playing it. A third reason was that it's a free-to-play game, and I've been so psychologically beaten down by the mental tactics to get you to spend money that front-load those games that I find them off-putting. Imagine my pleasant surprise that's encapsulated by the following statement. I don't know where I'd pay money if I wanted to at the time of writing. That's bearing in mind that I'm doing script writing between sessions. Hang on, I'm gonna have another quick round. Okay, I can definitely confirm that it has the usual trappings of free-to-play games. You can buy cosmetics, experience boosts, and a season pass kind of dealy. No pay-to-win stuff, but the fact that I had to go looking was, quite frankly, astounding. Then again, they've only got the 2 modes, but they are solid, and the driving and shooting mechanics equally so. That being said, let's talk about the different cars. I haven't tried all of them, but that's because with so many people jumping in and figuring things out, I'm just trying to learn how to play. Your game's quality can wildly vary depending on the merit of your teammates. That stated, I find myself playing as the truck that can shoot healing muck for allies in most rounds, and leaving the direct combat up to my teammates. Not that I can't deal damage when I need to. But yeah, you can play as a slow tank, literally, a zippy little sniper car, and an in-your-face style trike damage dealer, just to describe a few. The action is visceral, the explosions plentiful, and the satisfaction of finding random teammates that can hold their own is indescribable. For being so bare bones at the moment, I could genuinely see getting into this one, provided they continue to polish things, though. Early sessions from when I intended to review Speed Freaks were plagued by glitches, connection issues, and at least one hard crash to desktop. I get that it's early access and that it'll likely be patched, but my philosophy is that the second you open up your hand for potential payment, then issues deserve calling out that much more, even if in early access. Oh, and if I might make a suggestion to the developers, set separate Y inversion settings for mouse and keyboard versus controllers. I play not inverted on mouse, but inverted on controller when lying in bed, and it's a minor nuisance to have to switch between the two. Yes, I'm playing this in bed even. In spite of the early glitch-laden sessions, now that I've gotten a few more rounds in me, I'm very comfortable with saying that I like this one. If you have friends that might also enjoy this style of game, then seriously, check it out. This week I endeavored to get back from my, quite frankly still ongoing, fixation with PC building. Seriously, anyone need an entry-level gaming PC? But anyway, with my attempt to move on, I've been playing Firewatch. Longtime followers will recall I first dabbled with walking simulators well after they first appeared with a review of Dear Esther a little over 2 years ago. Huh, how time flies. Anyways, I needed a quick hit game to jump back into my rhythm, and Firewatch clocks in at about 3 to 4 hours of playtime, making it perfect to slot into my schedule. As I installed the game, I was expecting a relatively chill experience with an engrossing atmosphere. What I wasn't expecting was one of the most enrapturing and heartfelt stories I've experienced this year. I'll not be going into any spoilers past the first 15 minutes, so don't fret if you want to try it for yourself. You play as Henry, an everyman who starts the game as a likable but potentially flawed individual as he relays his life before the start of the game. I say potentially flawed because you have a fair say in how he portrays himself, both in pre-game background or spoken dialogue. Henry has taken a summer job in a national park as a fire lookout in order to get away from a relationship that's become complicated, troubled, and emotionally taxing. Upon arrival to your lookout post, you're introduced to your boss, Delilah. You communicate almost exclusively via radio transmissions, and let me say the voice acting is on point and the story delivery is top-notch. I initially thought I was just going to be performing relatively mundane tasks in a pleasant nature setting.
I'm staring at the big outcropping down here, but I'm not quite sure where to look for our pyrotechnicians.
Maybe keep heading west toward the lake.
What I actually got was a layered and gripping backstory of the park, nuanced and sympathetic personalities, and a heavy dollop of suspense and conspiracy. Even the park develops a personality of its own, revealing secrets and showing itself as more than just a pretty area for people to camp and hike. As far as the plots, most of them are resolved by the end, and again, without spoiling, the emotional weight hits well above anything beyond that I anticipated going in. This is all facilitated by fairly simple controls. As mentioned, it's a walking sim, albeit slightly more complex than other similar experiences. You do gain a small inventory to expand to traversal abilities, and you have a significant degree of autonomy when it comes to your communications, even being able to choose stoic silence. You may have some difficulty navigating the world if you're not familiar with orienteering or even just being able to use a basic map and compass setup, but honestly, that's the most significant criticism I can generate. Without giving away anything crucial for the story, there's only so much I can say, which I guess means this week's video is a bit shorter than usual. Try Firewatch for yourself and have a pleasant afternoon. This week I played Inside. I played a video game that has the title Inside, not the notion of me entertaining myself within a residence or domicile. I have about 3 other games that I'm currently playing or intending on playing, but they're all proving to be outside the scope of my usual weekly time constraints, so I figured I'd touch on Inside. Plus, one of my subscribers really seemed to go to bat for this when it came up on a community poll, so here we are. Inside is a bleak, realistic platformer where you control a small child through a world of hazards, disturbing imagery, and instantaneous death. This is not to be confused with Playdead's previous title, Limbo, also a bleak, realistic platformer where you control a small child through a world of hazards, disturbing imagery, and instantaneous death. At least they know their comfort zone, which is an ironic choice of words because their games continually make me feel immensely uncomfortable. In fact, if I had to review Inside in a single sentence, I would choose thusly: the most uncomfortable platformer that I'd gladly replay in a given afternoon. Then again, even an afternoon might be charitable, because with my most recent playthrough, if I were to cut all the deaths from my run, I'm fairly confident that it would take me less than 2 hours to go from start to end credits. Not that those 2 hours would be considered insubstantial. While an individual playthrough might be shorter than the runtime of some movies, the symbolism and environmental details are rich and weighty. In fact, this is another perfect example of a game that tells you nothing but shows you everything you need to know from the very moment you start playing. When you press start on a fresh run, you're not given a text blurb, any opening exposition, or even a settings menu. Your character just appears on screen and you're immediately given control. Within the first 5 minutes, you can establish the basics of what you need to grasp the situation. People are being harvested. If you're seen, then you're either shot on sight or vicious dogs are sicked on you. Whatever organization is behind the insidious plot believes that survivors and witnesses are just not worth the trouble. Even children. With the tone established, Inside then moves to lay out its style of gameplay. I said before it's a realistic platformer, which basically means that you're only able to jump about as high and far as the average human. Plus, falling more than 10 feet will likely mean severe injury and then respawning. Similarly, it's not just unrealistic platforming expectations that may kill you. As I mentioned before, dark forces and groups would sooner see you dead than look at you, and while the game doesn't focus on twitch responses, the platforming and puzzles that it does present put tremendous emphasis on observation and planning. It wants you to focus on timing and careful forethought before executing your best attempt at survival, but this means that even a careless move will mean an unceremonious or brutal end. Fortunately, the game is well paced so that even when death does come, it doesn't fixate on the failure or dwell too long, and you're never sent back more than a minute or two. Unfortunately, that doesn't entirely mitigate the frustration. There's a few in-game segments and puzzles that I would argue don't serve much relevant expansion for the plot, and in fact may be counter to how things progress later, particularly in a section where you have to traverse bodies of water with a merchild that remains entirely inactive and sinks to the bottom of the water while you're dry, but the second you touch moisture, he viciously comes to drag you down. The languid movement speed of this section and the slow and deliberate pace of how the puzzle progresses, in spite of being aware of the solution and simply having it be a matter of execution, becomes quite a factor of irritation, which says nothing about the story development that happens in one of these segments. I died to this child several times, even on my most recent playthrough, but after progressing far enough, you eventually encounter a section where you're supposed to get grabbed by the child, supposedly dragged to your death, but then experience some sort of mysterious factor that grants you the ability to breathe underwater as part of the story. Dissonant gameplay and narrative elements aside, I do feel that much of the frustration or oppressive mood the game hammers you with is intended. Reflecting on my latest run, there was no point where I would say that I was feeling jovial or happy. Engaged, definitely, and satisfied with some of the platforming and puzzling, but as I said close to the start, the feeling I found myself most familiar with at any given moment was uncomfortable. The imagery alone was often grotesque or dehumanizing, from parasites seemingly taking control of livestock to instill a murderous frenzy, to people being brainwashed until they're nothing more than flesh automatons to be designated as disposable equipment. Even the audio does a tremendous job of relaying the sense of unease, especially when things go deathly silent. Alright, I've managed to avoid most things spoiler so far, so from here on out I'll be discussing story elements, the ending, and arguably some of the most disturbing parts of the game. So for those that want to experience it for themselves and haven't done so already, I'll see you next week. For those that have played it, or don't care, let's continue. So as you control your character further into this adventure, you find yourself wandering into a massive industrial facility, and finally an office complex. All the while, you're seeing signs that there are effectively two societies, with the one that you come from being used to feed a need for what I interpret as labor or experimentation. There's metaphors and symbolism abound, but you can also just take it on face value. Of course, I don't know what to think about the last few minutes of the game. In your endeavor to undo the nefarious schemes that whatever planners have been enacting, you eventually find yourself trying to free, but then getting absorbed into and controlling a swirling mass of flesh. Seemingly almost immune to damage, but rampaging through the offices and labs while looking like a disembodied scrotum. Finally, after your rampage has ceased, you eventually escape the building with one last tumble down a cliffside, and the game ends after you come to rest with a lone ray of sunshine symbolizing that there is nothing more to do. Inside isn't one of my favorites of all time, and it's certainly not one that I play for a sense of joy, but it leaves a stark impression on me, and because of the bleak and fever dream-induced imagery, I'd recommend it as one that most should try if they have a free afternoon. This week I've been playing Stalker 2, Heart of Chernobyl. About a year and a half ago, I stated that this was one of the games I was looking most forward to. Since then, I've also dabbled with the prior Stalker trilogy and tracked down a physical copy of it on PS4 that had to be imported from Japan. To cover one thing I actively seek in games and can't seem to stop mentioning are titles that put an emphasis on atmosphere and coincidentally seem to come out of Eastern European developers. For the sake of avoiding spoilers, most of my footage and story recap will be just from the early game. You play as a rather mercenary individual who enters the zone with the intention of utilizing the anomalies that occur to get rich. In the process, you're interrupted by various parties, and then your equipment is stolen and you're left for dead. When you wake up, you're given some basic tips for survival by a local stalker, and begin your quest to find the guy who took your stuff. Although, from the very start of the game, you are being set up for subversion. When you first infiltrate the zone, you're relatively well equipped, health pickups are plentiful, and up until the moment you're caught, you feel fairly capable. Afterwards, the game not only takes away your equipment, but that sense of comfort along with it. The game quickly shifts from first-person shooter to first-person survival, and let me tell you up front that when you start this game, you will die. But we'll come back to that. The first major difference from Shadow of Chernobyl that I noticed in structure was rather than the bead and string means of progression, the game is fully open world. Freedom to walk in any direction until something, including the environment, tries to kill you. Yes, another thing I learned very quickly is that you don't need to be in active conflict to be in danger. Naturally occurring hazards around the exclusion zone can give you a wide variety of interesting ways to take a dirt nap. Did you stumble into something that looks like a pulsating force field? Well, you either get torn to pieces or get flung in any number of directions to have your skin upholster the nearby greenery. Maybe electric shots or gouts of flames are more your thing? Not to worry. Anyway, the takeaway I gathered was you must be ever vigilant when making your way from spot to spot. Casually walking into natural traps, any number of hostile animals or mutants, or even just stumbling into an encampment can have devastating consequences.
Hey, you! Back off! That's my loot. I was here first.
After a time, I traversed Hearts of Chernobyl, making sure I had every weapon I could loaded in case things got hairy fast. The level of caution that was instilled in me was almost jarring to the point I began monitoring the time of day before initiating quests. Unlike many games that just throw a blue filter over the screen to simulate night, Hearts of Chernobyl appropriately darkens everything, and while you have a head-mounted flashlight to aid you, it really only serves a benefit in confined spaces like tunnels and buildings. Out in the open, you are alone, vulnerable, and most importantly, visible to others. Shadow of Chernobyl Chernobyl's ability to portray a sense of the foreboding is impressive and is thankfully exemplified by the details of the world around you. If it wasn't, it would be very easy to walk into any number of death traps while simply going to your next objective, and that helps with the sense of immersion that I relish so much from Eastern European developers that make games like this. Certain story developments and character interactions were equally engrossing and facilitated a fair feeling of agency in the player. One early side quest has you out to find a religious painting that a guy remembers from his childhood that is located somewhere in a mysterious field of poppies. However, that field of flowers has a supernatural and fatal side effect. As you explore the flowers, you become drowsy, your stamina bar depletes, and you begin to hear voices. This field gets played up as one of the most deceptively dangerous areas of the map. As you approach it for the first time, though, you encounter another stalker who offers you the coordinates for the item you came for in exchange for looting the bodies of other stalkers that wandered into the field, who fell asleep and never woke up. I completed the looting, actively chugging energy drinks like a Japanese salaryman in the week before a deadline, and was gifted with the coordinates for the painting. The stalker then relays that if I sold him the painting instead, he'd give me a one-of-a-kind gun. Compelling, but given that my choice of gun was heavily dictated by whatever ammo was being scrounged off bodies rather than what I'd like to use, I ultimately decided to bring the painting back to the original quest giver. Like I said, engrossing and immersive. Unfortunately, that has to be couched in the fact that as deep as I was immersed when the game got good, when the game glitched out, I was ejected right back more violently than had I walked into one of those gravitational anomalies. The biggest issues I've heard about are more to do with the game's level of polish or lack therein in certain scenarios. I didn't encounter many instances of glitches, but what I did notice was the Xbox Series X hardware that I was playing on struggling to load appropriately, or keep up under the more strenuous moments. Saving often in this game becomes second nature to protect yourself from both the in-game hazards and the integrity of the game itself. GSC is fortunately putting out the patches with reliable frequency, but this led to another issue. Every time the game was patched, I lost setting adjustments that had been done prior. Fortunately for me, it was just Y inversion, but a friend of mine informs me this may be a wider Xbox issue. No wonder I've been favoring PC more lately. If physical PC copies were still a thing, or if consoles go all digital, I'm seriously contemplating abandoning consoles altogether. Speaking of patching though, does anyone else lament the loss of the days when a game shipped in a stable state because patches weren't a thing, and developers knew that if they shipped a buggy and broken game, then it was equivalent to a streaming personality coming out as being attracted to 12-year-olds? Yeah, I miss those days. Getting back to Hearts of Chernobyl and the tension it can instill when it eats its Wheaties, I came across another side effect that was both refreshing and disappointing. While I do get immersed and proportionally tense while playing, this had the unintended follow-through of emotionally and mentally draining me. Being so vigilant for an extended period starts to exhaust the player, making this game that, for me at least, is best enjoyed in chunks ranging for an hour or two. I alluded to it before, but in spite of being armed, this almost comes across as a survival horror experience. In spite of the technical shortcomings and the emotionally taxing state that is induced when you become immersed, I can confidently state this game is giving me what I came here looking for. It may take me a while to get through, and might have to be the primary focus when I take some time off in January, but I plan to keep going with this one. I suspect others would want to, and appropriately should wait until a few more patches come out, but if you're willing to forgive the current state, the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone welcomes you with a warm embrace. Just ignore that feeling that you're now at the mercy of whoever is holding you. This week I replayed Distance, and I don't mean the concept of measurement from one location to another. Distance is an atmospheric science fiction platforming time attack racing title. Yeah, a lot to unpack just by the specification of genre subset. An initial comparison I'd make is by combining the mechanics of Rush 2049 with a mood somewhere between System Shock, Inside, and Super Meat Boy. Like I said prior, I replayed this game because a long time ago, back when it was in early access, I remember getting thoroughly absorbed into it, but I reached the end of what was the campaign at the time, and was left with a core memory of Blue Balls, which is not a core memory one wants to have. Since then, it's been set in my backlog of games I'll eventually go back to, and this week ended up being a good time for that. Most of my spare time has been spent either with Lethal Company, and I'm finally getting enough of a reprieve from work to go visit friends and family that I've been meaning to see since the holidays. Overall, this means I've had less time to play new titles, but Distance is, in spite of all the heaps of praise I'm about to give it, relatively short on just the base campaign aspect. There's a reason I'm qualifying that statement, but we'll get to it later. That aside, it made it perfect for me to still be able to get an upload in for this week. Let me say that, until I played Distance for the first time, I had never experienced a racing game that was so thoroughly able to instill a sense of the foreboding and the ominous. Distance's main challenge is in the platforming, and it's a race against the clock. There are no NPCs or other opponents. It is you against the environment, and the environment seemingly has taken that personally. Without having looked up anything and strictly experiencing the game, the main campaign seems to be a symbolic representation of data or artificial intelligence navigating networks and manifesting in a form that makes sense for a human to comprehend. In this case, a car with enhanced traversal abilities traveling warped and hostile highways. Using that symbolic illustration for data transfer and AI, your objective seems to be making your way from data hub to data hub, with the ultimate objective of transferring out of the space station networks back to Earth, through the visual metaphors of cars and roads. I could be entirely wrong though. Again, this is just what I've taken away through my general observation. Anyway, as you start out, you're driving through relatively simple pathways with minimal obstacles or interference, and you're introduced to your platforming abilities. Initially, you're just given a simple boost and later a vertical jump. A short time later, you're given wings and the ability to fly so long as you have the boost ability to use. And so long as you maintain speed, you can also drive your vehicle on walls or ceilings. While you are progressing from level to level and being given your movement abilities, the game is also looking to maintain engagement with the use of atmospheric storytelling. Every so often, your course navigation is interrupted by some entity that I can't help but feel does not regard you with a sense of warm fuzziness. This is the first racing title that's ever made me feel scared in the sense of being unnerved and not wanting to progress. These moments of terror serve a purpose though, in that they accentuate the high-intensity driving and platforming with moments of downtime, which is valuable because at its peak, distance also serves as a wonderful zoner game. As in a game that, while you're focused and within the groove, you get a tremendous sense of satisfaction along with pulling off feats within the game that when looked up in hindsight you can't help but be impressed with yourself. Rattling off the intense and rapid series of inputs in order to successfully navigate some of the more complicated tracks is a rush that I rarely experience, but it's not a constant or given state. While it is entirely possible to do these tracks on a first-time run, for most people you're going to trial and error your way through a few tracks, which is not necessarily the worst thing. I said that this game is also a race against the clock, and you're incentivized to revisit tracks to lower your best runs. Plus, when you beat the main campaign, there's massive amounts of user-generated content with the option to race ghosts of other people on your friends list. Or, if you're a mad person, you can endeavor to try and go for world records. The package isn't perfect though, and I'd wager there's a few people that wouldn't be interested in anything I've talked up so far. While rare, the main campaign does have one or two cheat moments with cues that are relayed so late before you approach the hazard that you're highly likely to die at least once on 2 levels. Plus, after you've gotten a ways into the campaign, the interruption of the dark atmosphere moment started to drag down the pacing and went on just a little bit too long while I waited for the pace to pick back up so I could get back into the zone. And I need to reiterate that this game's wealth of user-generated content ensures that the price of entry guarantees an almost infinite return on investment if you find yourself jiving with the mechanics. And I've only touched on the campaign. I haven't even begun to go into the arcade and stunt modes. Take that for what you will. This week I've been playing Black Mesa. A while back, I revisited the original Half-Life, having never played the PC version. It turns out I didn't care much for Half-Life 1. The pacing was a bit tedious, the enemies were too bullet-spongy, and ultimately the game was irritating me the more time I spent with it, so I gave up on the game and moved on. If you want, you can go check out my full review, which should be linked on screen somewhere, but if you just want it heavily paraphrased, I liked the game's combat, the settings started strong, there was a good emphasis on set-piece moments, but as things went on, things grew monotonous, and ultimately I've been spoiled by modern game design conventions that Half-Life 1 did not have. Upon the suggestion of one of my viewers at the time, I then installed Black Mesa and decided to save it for a rainy day, and this week has had plenty of rain. For the potentially unfamiliar, Black Mesa is a from-the-ground-up modern remake of Half-Life made by a group called the Crowbar Collective. There was no official endorsement or development from the Valve, yet it exists on their Steam storefront. Something I find amazing in this era of modern game companies continually being the absolute worst. Anyway, I feel a little guilty for saying this, but the graphical upgrade did a lot for me. I say I feel guilty because I'm one of those people that argues against bleeding-edge graphics and strongly believes mechanics and interaction should be a much higher priority. In fact, I'm about to drop what I might consider my hottest take gaming opinion. Graphics didn't need to get any better than the PS3 and Xbox 360 generation. Then again, Black Mesa isn't exactly a visual powerhouse, using assets that would look right at home on the PS3 and Xbox 360 version of the orange box. And that may be all it needed for the graphical boost. I'm focusing on visual fidelity so much because it did wonders for immersion and differentiation of environment. The lighting and level structure even went so far as to turn the mood into an almost horror-like experience. The extra level of detail also heavily complemented the atmospheric storytelling. Ooh, pizza. Gameplay-wise, Black Mesa isn't worlds apart from the original, but there are plenty of subtle touches that make the game feel much more fluid and dynamic. The upgrade in engine extends that to the enemies as well. One key way that makes me consider Black Mesa a definitive upgrade is the fact that I actually made it to Zen this time. The otherworldly ambience was a wonderful complement to the science facility that was starting to overstay its welcome, which I suppose leads me to the blemishes that keep me from doling out only praise. The pacing in segments definitely felt improved, although I digress. I couldn't entirely tell if that was the game trimming fat of certain levels, or just the fact that I was relatively recently playing the original game and just knew where to go. Another praise I must also qualify is the sound and music. The depth of the background noise accentuated the moods on hand, and the music when it kicked in delivered some of the most pulse-pounding action I've had outside of multiplayer in some time. Unfortunate that the music only responded to environmental triggers as opposed to enemy presence or other indicators, because there was more than one occasion where I finished a fight, and then with a hard and heavy battle theme playing, I bravely made my way to an adrenaline-filled sequence of topping off my health and shields at a nearby dispenser. Another blemish is the irritating puzzle platforming design close to the end of the lab levels, which feels like it relies on quick save and trial and error more than it should, which in my opinion is to any degree at all. Finally, there was one sequence that almost drove me to dropping the game. At one point, you have to escort a security guard with access codes in order to move on through a level. We have a mandatory stealth section, but that wasn't necessarily the issue. The issue is we made it through the stealth section, got to the building exit, I stepped outside, then he got spotted, and instead of following me out, ran back in to immediately get killed. I was briefly stuck in a failure and reloading loop because of this asshole. Then, after fighting my way through that, I get him to the end of the level. Now, I want you to observe these next two sequences and tell me what is the functional difference.
That could have been a lot worse. I tell you what, that could have been a lot worse. Wait, what?
One is me blowing off steam and having to escort this prick, and the other is seemingly for storytelling or to make cruel jokes at my expense. I almost punched a hole through my monitor when this happened. Now, in spite of my negative rambling for the last couple paragraphs, I don't want you to take away the message that I didn't like Black Mesa. Far from it. It's nowhere near approaching my favorite games of all time, but it was exactly the update the original Half-Life needed for me to want to see it through to completion. I mean, just the fact I made it to Zen this time shows my willingness to keep playing regardless of the issues I mentioned prior. I'd love to see more games get the same treatment, but then again, very few game companies would allow anyone to touch their precious intellectual property. This week I've been playing Lethal Company. Now, under most circumstances, I'm not one to jump onto the new hot multiplayer game, which is a shame because I'd probably be able to ride the YouTube algorithm a little bit easier. However, while I'm not above taking on a more current game, I'm usually contented to be doing my own thing. It just so happens that Lethal Company has managed to find its way into several of my friends' libraries, and the curiosity got the better of me. I was already aware of Lethal Company to a minor degree, having seen several memes and amusing clips popping out here and there. So, with the knowledge of the odd viral clip as the only context I had for the game, I got together with a few friends and dove into a lobby. The first thing I have to say is that this game is not friendly to those without any experience. The game has a minimalist approach to explanations with little more than an in-game clipboard representing the game's instruction manual, and almost nothing as far as tutorials. Seeing this, I quickly elected to forgo my usual process of remapping the controls to my Razer Tartarus peripheral, and plugged in a standard Xbox gamepad, which fortunately was almost completely supported for the basic functions. If I may give a recommendation for anyone looking to try Lethal Company, make an endeavor to have a full group with at least one person who has played a round or two prior and understands the minimum necessary requirements to get started. I say this because when the game begins, you and your crew are almost immediately dropped into the hull of a small spacefaring vessel with the task of acquiring items of value in order to meet a quota of salvage in a certain time span. The first step of being able to select a world to visit, and this is where things can start getting a little obtuse, is that you have to use an in-game console to type out commands so that you can navigate your ship. And I mean actually typing out the commands like you would an old MS-DOS prompt. Once you make your first visit planetside, you're introduced to the gameplay loop where things get interesting. The harvesting and survival. Each planet you go to usually has a primary feature of some abandoned or decrepit industrial facility with various pieces of valuable scrap to bring back to the ship, along with interstellar monstrosities that have a passing interest in making your body look like the contents of a pulled pork sandwich.
We gotta get past this Steve. Straight.
You kidding me? I ran directly into
Hey,
him.
Yeah. Hello.
He's the only one alive. He's the only one alive, so he's at the door, so...
To aid in your survival, you're given nothing. This makes your entry into the various buildings very tense, and would heavily incentivize that me and my crew move as one unit, keeping our eyes open in all directions for the sake of our preservation. In the lore of the game that it is loosely presented, on a fresh campaign you're quickly made to realize the level of importance that the company you're working for holds you at, which is barely enough to loan you a ship that can jettison you out into the cold vacuum of space if you have the audacity to not make profit for them.
Below standard. Welcome to our disciplinary process.
As such, everyone's early campaigns are likely just running into the building to make a little just over enough to not die, with the rest of the money being used to acquire tools that will better improve the odds of survival from run to run. As you progress some and successfully start gathering enough scrap to exceed quota, you can start purchasing things like flashlights and maybe even defensive implements in order to increase your odds that you'll be able to get out if you encounter something that wants you dead. Now, in these base mechanics and story, it may not necessarily sound like anything special, but the co-op element to it is where this game arguably shines, and why it has spectacularly taken off the way it has. You see, Lethal Company features an in-game proximity-based voice chat that is not only used to coordinate with your other crewmates, but accentuates the hostile atmosphere and really helps to instill a sense of dread when someone on your team stops talking. This is because when one of your crew gets off in some gruesome or otherwise unpleasant fashion, they become muted in-game. This becomes even more entertaining from a horror angle when they're a room or two away, start screaming, and then everything goes deathly silent. Do you go in to investigate and try and salvage something they might have dropped as well as reclaim their body to avoid a penalty? Or do you cut your losses and try to get back to the ship with the hope that you'll be able to do better on the next round? On that note, can you even reclaim their body, or did they accidentally jump to their untimely death in a vain effort to avoid getting torn apart, like I did this one round?
Did we enter the back rooms?
I don't like this rule.
Ah! Oh, God! Get that thing!
What? Ah! Hit it! Hit it!
How do I leave?
Run! Run away!
Oh God! Why did he kill all of us?
Orko? Guys? Anybody?
Oh,
shite.
Jesus Christ, Dodd.
I think it's just me. I need to leave. Oh, God.
However, even if your team has successfully gathered items and managed to get back to your boss to redeem the value of your salvage, the sense of apathy toward your mortality and overt greed and the awareness of an ever-present quota ensures that the oppression doesn't let up. This may be why you and your crew may also be prone to find things to laugh about while you're exploring.
I'm sure everyone else is curious, too.
Yeah, I want to see this.
Yep, he got eaten. Oh, God.
If you and your team are consistently able to meet quota, you start gaining access to more worlds with more expensive loot and a wider variety of interstellar hostiles. Unlocking certain pieces of equipment also enables a wider variety of tactics and playstyles, such as using walkie-talkies to have one person stay on the ship and point out the locations of loot and monsters while the other three do the harvesting. For me, the steep learning curve, a sense of collective struggle, an overwhelming need to maintain camaraderie, and an insidious and uncaring atmosphere laced in undertones of late-stage capitalism, combined with the overtly hostile murder monsters, has produced a game that I can understand why it's generated such a strong appeal. Now, that's not saying it's a perfect package, and I'm not just talking about the learning curve. While the game overall is functional, there's a lot of small issues that pop up. Most of these issues manifest as minor graphical oversights, such as assets that clip through the ship, or fellow explorers just plain disappearing while you're bumming around the vessel getting ready for the next mission. However, my game royally screwed up after my controller became unplugged once or twice, necessitating a full restart. Plus, the fact that some things can just phase through solid material, like the bees, shows that this game has a large degree of improvements that can still be made. I would put more emphasis on these, but from what I understand, this game is made entirely by a solitary developer that may or may not be a furry. If this game is solo developed, then that makes it just more impressive as far as I'm concerned. Additionally, Lethal Company has already developed a tremendous modding community, adding further depth and content to the title that gives entertainment value far surpassing many AAA projects these days. Hell, me and my friends are expecting another playthrough this afternoon using a mod that enables the possibility of a crew with up to 32 players, although I'm pretty sure we're only going to go in with about 6. Lethal Company is one of those rare games that, in spite of its flaws, has managed to stumble across a formula that makes it vastly entertaining. As I said prior, though, in order to get past the initial hurdles of the game, try and go in with a full crew and have at least one person who knows what they're doing in advance. This week I've been playing Titanfall 2, another title that's been a semi-permanent fixture on my need-to-play backlog for the past several years. The original Titanfall, a now extinct game, was an interesting proof of concept back in the day of Call of Duty-style gunfighting broken up with occasional giant mechs getting dropped into battle to be piloted by players. It was a multiplayer-only game that tried to deliver a pre-written narrative, a foolhardy venture but a laudable attempt. Titanfall 2, by comparison, features a single-player campaign, and one reason Titanfall 2 was always something I wanted to get around to playing was its almost ubiquitous appearance on underappreciated games lists. I mean, hell, at the time of writing, I could go to my local GameStop and grab a copy for $2.99. Anyway, the only other relevant bits of knowledge I had going into Titanfall 2 was that it served as a foundation for the later game Apex Legends, which I put a couple dozen hours into prior, and that it was made by Respawn Entertainment, a studio comprised of former Infinity Ward developers after Activision went their usual path of being pulsating dick blisters on the game industry. Although I'm not sure EA is any better, but I digress. Starting the campaign, you play as Jack Cooper, a rifleman in the Frontier Militia, a space army fighting against a conglomerate intending on sucking planets dry for profit and disregarding any consequences for people of the world themselves called the Interstellar Manufacturing Corporation. In your first battle, your mentor and resident mech pilot gets mortally wounded and gives you the ability to pilot his war machine, BT-7274. One thing I noted when starting up was the controls. They are fantastic. Being former Call of Duty devs, it makes sense that they had shooting controls down to an art, and I was fortunately already familiar with them thanks to my time in Apex Legends. Standard movements and shooting are snappy and precise, but then we add enhanced traversal abilities like wall running to the mix. I occasionally struggled with them, but I more attributed that to the fact that I was mostly playing this game from my bed while I was laid low with COVID and using a controller. Then again, that was only while I was in standard foot soldier mode. Whenever I swapped to the mech piloting mode, movements were appropriately far more weighty and cumbersome, but delivers the power fantasy rather effectively when you can reduce normal enemies to clouds of red mist. The arsenal of options you could bring into mech fights was also visceral and impressive, especially since you can swap them in and out at any time. Whether I was in mech or on foot though, I never felt powerless. The tight movement and controls consistently ensured I was never without a tactical option, and any deaths I experienced were resolutely due to my own errors in judgment. Except for those walking spider mines. Those things. Level structure was also accentuated by the moving and shooting mechanics, with some sections being first-person platforming levels, while others focused strictly on combat, and one or two levels that I considered highlights of spectacle with how they incorporated the two. With pacing sometimes moving at an almost breakneck speed, I never felt bored during my playthrough. Now, one area I was genuinely surprised at in hindsight was the level of characterization the game presents. Early in the game, you snag an enemy radio to listen in on the big baddies you'll eventually be facing, but the more engrossing sides were your own interactions with BT. At moments throughout the story, you can choose how to interact with your mech AI, and I found these segments to provide a degree of levity with how I conducted myself. These actually got me invested in the latter half of the game once stakes began to rise on a personal level, which is why I was left so saddened at the end. Not only by the story itself, which in spite of the game's age I won't be spoiling because I'd like you to play this game if you haven't done so already, but by the brevity of the campaign. By the time the credits rolled, my playtime was sitting just short of 5 hours. I could have dove into multiplayer, but given the age of the game, I'd be extremely hesitant since anyone still playing is likely capable of casually crushing those cruising in out of curiosity. The fact that one of the first things I did upon completing the story was to Google word on a potential Titanfall 3 should be plenty of an endorsement of this game in spite of how old it is at this point. Also, referring back to the start of the video, you can grab a hard copy for PS4 or Xbox One for less than the cost of a gallon of milk. So what are you waiting for? This and last week I've been playing Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. This was at the behest of one of my viewers after I played Speed Freaks. That, plus I've been seeing coverage of it from other YouTubers I follow. Anyway, once again I'm pulling out for the second time in a month my I Don't Know Warhammer lore hat. Or at least I didn't at the start of my playthrough, where I take control of a black shield of the Death Watch named Brother Titus. If you don't know what any of that stuff means, don't worry, neither did I. Taking a moment to heap my first bit of praise, and with the context of not knowing the first bit of jack or shit about the 40k universe, the game made me want to know more, but I'll cover that in further depth in just a bit. You start on a mission to kill invading aliens as a genetically and surgically augmented super soldier. To do this, you are given the employ of a chainsaw sword and an early selection of the chunkiest firearms I've had the pleasure of experiencing in a while. Eventually, you succeed on your immediate mission, get overwhelmed, and then get rescued before the final blow is delivered. Titus wakes up sometime later, seemingly restored to a position of full glory, and from there you follow his tale of mowing down swaths of mindless aliens and corrupted heretics. One thing I heard in the lead-up is that Space Marines 2 is set to revive the sentiments of the golden age of the meathead shooters, reminiscent reminiscent of games like Gears of War. Unfortunately, I don't have that frame of reference because I never got into Gears of War, but not for any lack of trying. Murky, brown, slow-paced, cover-based shooters were just never my thing. Anyways, getting back to what I was saying about lore, the game intelligently places its dropping of proper nouns and background context enough for the player to be able to follow along and fill in the blanks for themselves, while avoiding the exposition dump pitfall of making the player tune out to excessive jargon. In the meantime, I was able to keep up, but the game's confident visual style and richly detailed environments hooked me even further, betraying a galaxy with lore that, according to some of my more versed acquaintances, runs deeper than the Marianas Trench. And that's one reason so far why I like Space Marines 2. The tale of a protagonist can be involving and interesting in its own right, but if you really want to hook me, have it take place in a fully realized setting. From the minor roles of maintenance and logistics personnel taking place around you, to the allusions to battles or significant events long ago, I want to find out more about the society of blindly allegiant meathead warriors. Speaking of meathead warriors, the combat is possibly one of the most gorgeous examples of simple but satisfying I've played in years. Seamlessly switching from firearms to melee combat, there was rarely a time when I felt overrun. Most basic enemies can be reduced to red putty with a single swing of the mighty chainsaw sword or power blade, and the basic sidearm pistol has the sound and impact that makes you feel like you're firing 50 caliber rounds. Oftentimes the game sends waves of basic enemies at you, Zerg Rush style, and to see a single round railing and reducing whole crowds of Tyranids has this hypnotically pleasing effect that turns to raw testosterone-laced pleasure when you jack up that level with fully automatic weaponry. Space Marine 2 also mechanically incentivizes you to get down and dirty, with glory kills not only letting you deliver a gruesome end to opponents that clearly deserve it, but also helping recharge your shields mid-battle. You can't totally turn your brain off though, and mindlessly swing away with your melee weapon of choice though. Boss fights that occasionally take place require attention to surroundings and resources. You do have a dodge mechanic, and while I used it frequently, I did notice that it offers an absurd degree of protection through the use of invulnerability frames. Actually, while I mentioned the gameplay occasionally tries to keep you from turning your brain off, the visceral and visually stunning battles kind of had an opposite effect when it came to the analysis part of my brain. At times I found myself lost in thought, critically looking at this warrior society, its blind adherence to a particular dogma, and the offhanded remarks against the scientists and intellectuals even within their own ranks. In the slower paced sections of the game, I'd be pondering the fascistic nature and unquestioning loyalty to an almost religious doctrine that the in-game culture portrays, with the belief that those who think differently must be purged. Then the battles would kick in, and my brain would be reset with the thought process being something along the lines of
Purge the heretics and non-believers who dare desecrate the image of our emperor!
Oh well, at least we can take solace our society hasn't taken that kind of turn. For the moment, anyways. The game, of course, isn't perfect, though. By the time I'd reached the end of the campaign, the mechanics had just started to wear out their welcome, and when prior bosses are getting rolled out to fill the runtime, I'd argue to developers that you're better off just not doing that in the first place. The sound design also had a frequently recurring issue, where I would constantly be wandering in and out of earshot of conversations taking place around me, and the only way I would be able to get the full context of the conversation was by watching the subtitles.
Sensor is intact. Can we act? Apparently not. It's this or nothing.
Finally, the underground lab level with the heavy reliance on rats, and the requirement of using a flamethrower as a weapon was more of a nuisance than I would have liked to have dealt with. Give me a week off to play something else, and I'd wager I'd be willing to jump back in, though. One thing I haven't mentioned is the game has minor splinter campaigns that take place tangential to Captain Titus and his affairs, multiplayer modes, and the campaign can be played entirely in co-op. Plus, the game seems ready-made for a Horde mode, which it seems is eventually set to come out according to the Season Pass. Between Speed Freaks and Space Marines 2, I've been having a pretty good time. Plus, the dipping of my toes into the wider 40k universe and the compulsions to learn more has me constantly thinking, shit, am I becoming a fan of Warhammer 40k? At least as far as the lore and video games are concerned. Keep that overpriced board game shit as far away from me as you can. I have less than zero interest in getting into a heated argument about which of these slightly off-putting ideologies is better, or whose tape measure is more accurate on a nanometer level. This week I've been playing Wreckfest. Actually, I've been up to several things for the past 2 weeks, some of which I probably will tell you about next week. That's also why I had to take a break, but enough explanations on my attempts to avoid mentally burning out and crashing. In spite of the upload gap, though, I have been on a bit of a Bugbear Entertainment kick lately, having recently done a retro review of Flat Out Ultimate Carnage. On that note, being a fan of Bugbear's previous works, Wreckfest has been in my priority backlog, and I figured now was a better time than ever. Wreckfest is a somewhat grounded vehicular arcade racing game based around mixed terrain tracks with an emphasis on damage, carnage, and rust-coated improvised mayhem. It's not entirely dissimilar to their Flat Out games, but there is a key differentiation between them and Wreckfest in the sense of tone and, as I mentioned prior, grounding. While not a simulator, the racing driving physics and vehicle behavior feel much more realistic, and the lack of things like nitro boost and the casual windshield ejection of the driver give the sense that the game is trying to take itself more seriously. Braking points, racing lines, and the maintenance of momentum led to several pulse-pounding paint exchanges while banging through corners. In fact, it's easy to maintain a sense of engagement and tension in the races in spite of the fact that going above 100 miles per hour is a fairly uncommon occurrence, especially in the early divisions. On the other hand, the game takes opportunities towards the absurd and silly with the variety of vehicles that you can select and race. Not just cars and trucks, but lawn tractors, combine harvesters, limousines, and even motorized sofas. They also keep some of the goofy spirit alive with cosmetics you can put on your car. Things like hats, skulls, or oversized novelty chainsaws. I didn't use any of them myself, but I digress. Also, while Smash Party definitely favors those that adopt proper racing lines and tactics, it is most definitely not above making you play dirty. In fact, there are bonus challenges in most racing career events that reward you for spinning out, causing to careen into walls, or outright wrecking your opponents. Although it can be rage-inducing to get clipped by another car on the last lap and get royally screwed. Funnily enough, I had one race event that I won, even though technically not a single vehicle crossed the finish line. I just happened to travel the farthest before every single car was reduced to scrap metal, and I loved that the game accounted for that. It's not a perfect package, though. While I found immense pleasure in the pure race events, the Demolition Derby matches were far more hit and miss. Yeah, the visceral and satisfying crashes were top-notch, but in later moments of the derbies, it would often come down to chasing one or two living opponents, which wouldn't seem out of place to have the Benny Hill theme playing in the background. Also, a rather exploitable respawn function neuters a good amount of the tension and basically enables you to go screaming into a swirling mass of cars, get your hit in, and then press a button to reload your shot, as it were, with your car serving as the ammunition. I'd say a last man standing style race event might have been a good mix to try, but who knows, maybe they tested it and it didn't work. Whatever. Playing Crash Fiesta, I found an amusing ironic dichotomy. I've been playing it almost exclusively on my Steam Deck with limited exception for the captures I used for the review, thank you Steam Cloud Save Services, and I play my deck almost exclusively in bed when I'm winding down for the night. Of a related side note real quick, it's harder to appreciate on the Steam Deck screen, but when I switched to the desktop, I was impressed by the visual quality, but now I'm getting sidetracked again. Oh yeah, Steam Deck wind down sessions. However, I get so absorbed in the collision hootenanny that I often end up playing later than I should, and if that doesn't serve as a final takeaway, then I don't know what else to tell you. Wreckfest is tense and incredibly fun, whether you want a single quick race or a literal marathon session. Plus, the added support and ongoing events may keep me coming back for a while. This week I replayed Half-Life 2. Like Half-Life 1 about 4 months ago, Valve has gone back to one of their seminal titles, dug out a bunch of behind-the-scenes and previously thought lost media, took a few extra options and bonus features, packed it into the base game, then on top of all of that, they make the game free while bundling the micro-sequels of Half-Life 2 Episodes 1 and 2 into one package. They even put out a documentary about the making of Half-Life 2 on YouTube, also like they did previously with Half-Life 1. Unlike Half-Life 1 on PC though, this one I did play before. Multiple times in fact, except never on PC, so I guess this is a bit of a first. But yeah, my first exposure to Half-Life 2 was bundled in my copy of the Orange Box on PS3 in 2007. I'm not old, what are you talking about? I beat it for the first time there, then again on the Xbox 360, where I 1000-pointed all the achievements. But that was around the last time, which means it's probably been about 15 years since my last full playthrough, so what better time for a refresher? To meet my obligation of story recapping, Gordon Freeman, after surviving the affairs of Black Mesa, is dropped into what looks like an Eastern European city by some private interdimensional agency represented by a serpent-like man in a suit with the veiled intention to mix things up and overthrow the totalitarian society imposed by some otherworldly authority. There, plot recap over, moving on to the atmosphere. One of my chief issues with Half-Life 1 was the setting, with the majority of the game taking place in a science and military compound that struck me as so unwieldy and unrealistic that it was hard to achieve immersion. Half-Life 2 has no such issue. The environments you navigate feel bleak and despondent, but still alive and practical, both through environmental storytelling and the activities of the NPCs.
This is how it always starts. First the building, then the whole block. They have no reason to come to our place. Don't worry, they'll find one.
Valve in the new documentary cites their work on realistic human expression and largely succeeded. There are stilted and robotic moments, but even 2 decades later, these are some of the most believable in-game interactions I've seen while still being fully dynamic, as in you can watch them and pay attention, or you can do as you please and act like a jackass while jumping on the furniture as the super serious drama takes place around you. Of course, there are cracks that pop up in presentation, primarily around the physics engine. With the vehicle driving sections, it did occasionally stray into the frustrating, but outside of traversing in a car or boat, I found these moments more endearing or whimsical, probably due to the fact that the same engine powers Team Fortress 2, where I've seen the same quirks, and I'm slowly closing in on the 7,000 hour mark for that game. As far as gameplay and level traversal, even 20 years on, this game succeeds in keeping the players hooked, inserting micro-puzzles, introducing varied situations, or even just by laying out environmental features for you to use as you see fit. The game still makes players feel empowered and in control through what I can only describe as hauntingly intelligent design, partly thanks to the most ingenious feature of the game, the gravity gun.
You can call it the zero-point energy field manipulator if you really want to.
In other less inspired titles run by corporate bigwigs, it would be the main hook and probably the prominent focus of the game, but here it's merely another tool in the game's repertoire. Puzzle completion, projectile weapon generation, environmental preparation, resource gathering utility, this one piece of equipment is incredible. The variance and differentiation of pacing it enables is one reason why, even in the rare points where frustrations may appear, you quickly mentally move on. Okay, introduction of negative perspectives established, initiate tonal shift to criticisms and complaints. While rare, yes, even Half-Life 2 has its gear grinding moments. For me, it was primarily in the late game, where the liberation and uprising was happening all around me. Understandably chaotic and dangerous, but above anything else, my frustrations were centered around the sections that had striders that were shooting at me. Those, along with the inability to discern the path forward through the level, and a couple moments in the final section where I learned I was literally playing the game wrong by ignoring certain health pickups, got me dangerously close to the "I'm not having fun and I'm going to stop playing" threshold. But close wasn't quite close enough, and even now, the ending is still pulse-pounding and incredible. The set-piece moments, the tech behind the NPCs and their interactions, the mechanical empowerment of the player, and above all else, the legacy of what Half-Life 2 did and how it collectively raised the bar of game development as a whole. Half-Life 2 is still a certified classic. I'll contend there is no such thing as a perfect game, and while tastes are subjective and methods and tech for game making are ever evolving, Half-Life 2, I would argue, makes casual brushes with perfection. If you haven't gotten it already, even during the free window, then I need to tell you to your face, seriously look at what you're doing with your life as a gamer. And with the end of this video, we move into 2025. Thanks again for watching, especially if you stuck around all the way to the end. I'm probably not going to do any giveaways this week, just because I'm still trying to catch up with the last few. Once that's all said and done, I'll probably throw a few Steam codes onto my YouTube social media posts. I've already got a few more projects in the pipeline, and I can't wait to tell you about them. Have a happy new year, and as always, thanks for watching, and keep your head on your shoulders.